Section 36 of Philip Augustus by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. There was a party of travellers wound down through the beautiful valleys and over the rich hills that lie between Pacy and Rolleboise, proceeding slowly and calmly, though with a certain degree of circumspection, as if they were not at all without their share of the apprehensions to which travellers of every kind were exposed in those days, and yet were embarrassed by the presence of some one whose sex or age prevented them from proceeding more rapidly. As the head of the cavalcade was seen, agitated by the breeze, various of those light habiliments which have been used in all ages to give the female figure a degree of butterfly flutter, which seems to court pursuit, and it appeared out of consideration for the frailer limbs of the part of the troop thus clothed, that the iron-clad warriors which formed the main body proceeded at so slow and easy a pace. The whole party might consist of 50 persons, 4 or 5 of whom, by their pennons and arms, were distinguished as knights, while the rest showed but the sword and buckler of the squire, or the archer's quiver, longbow, and round target. Except an éclaireur thrown out before to mark the way, the female part of the troop took the lead, and as far as could be judged from appearance, the rest was but an escort attending upon them. One of the knights, however, whose helmet nodded with plumes, and whose arms were glittering with gold, ever and anon spurred forward, and, with bending head and low musical voice, addressed a few words to the fair girl who headed the troop, demanding now whether she was fatigued, now whether she felt the cold, now promising speedy repose, and now offering a few words of somewhat commonplace gallantry concerning bright eyes, rosy lips, and inspiring smiles. To his questions concerning her comfort the lady replied briefly and as coldly as courtesy permitted, and to his gallant speeches the chilling unmoved glance of her large dark eye might have afforded sufficient answer, had he been one easily rebuffed. The only uncalled-for words which she addressed to him herself tended but to ask where it was that her father had appointed to meet her, and on his replying that a place called Drocourt had been named, some 5 leagues farther, she relapsed into silence. The young knight, however, though on every check he received he sunk back into himself with an air of deep despondency, still returned to his point, holding perseverance to be the most serviceable quality in the world in all dealings with the fair, and thus, from time to time, he continued his assiduities, notwithstanding cold looks and scanty answers, till at length the road, descending, began to wind along the banks of the Seine. Here his attention became more entirely directed to precautions against surprise, and the increased haste and circumspection which he enjoined seemed to imply that he found himself upon hostile and dangerous ground. "See you no ferry-boat," cried he, "along the river? Look out, Arnoul, look out! We must get across as soon as may be." "The ferry lies beyond this woody tongue of land, my lord," replied the man. "'Tis not a mile hence, and there is no town between, so we may pass easily." And spurring on, the party entered the pass, between the wood which skirted down from the road to the river on the one side, and the high chalky cliffs on the other. The knight in the gilded armour had received a fresh rebuff from the lady whose favour he seemed so anxious to win, and having retired to his companions, who, as we have shown, were a few steps behind, was conversing with them in an earnest but undertone, when from an ambush in the wood, which had escaped even the eyes of the advanced scout, rushed forth a body of horsemen, with such rapid force as to separate entirely the female part of the cavalcade from the escort. It was done in an instant, but in truth it needed such rapidity of attack to render it, in itself, anything short of madness. For, when the escort recovered in a degree from their first astonishment, they found that 7 men formed the whole force that had thrown them into such confusion. Before, however, this became apparent, the leader of their adversaries shouting, "Accussi! Accussi!" spurred like lightning upon the knight we have before mentioned, and at one blow of his battle-axe dashed him under his horse's feet. A squire behind shared the same fate. A man-at-arms followed, and each of De Courcy's followers, fighting as if inspired by the same daring valour that animated their lord, the escort were driven back along the road, leaving 4 or 5 saddles vacant. Then, however, the tide of the battle turned. The knights at the head of the escort saw the handful of men to which they were opposed, and ashamed of yielding a step to so scanty a body, 4 of them united their efforts to attack De Courcy, while another rallied their followers, and the young knight was in turn driven back, now striking at one, now at another, now parrying the blows that were aimed at himself, and now showering them thick upon the head of the opponent that he had singled out for the moment. Separated from the escort which attended her, the lady we have mentioned, with her women, had in the meanwhile endeavoured to escape from the scene of strife which had so suddenly arisen, by hurrying on upon the road. But the scout, who had turned at the first noise of the affray, caught her bridle, and notwithstanding her prayers and entreaties, would not suffer her to proceed. The danger, indeed, to which she was exposed was not for the moment great, as by this time the first impetuous attack of De Courcy and his followers had driven the escort back beyond the turning of the wood, and nothing could be gathered of the progress of the fight but from the trampling of horses heard sounding this way or that, and the cries and shouts of the combatants approaching or receding as the battle turned. "Lady Isidore! Lady Isidore!" cried a girl who followed her. "It is the Sire de Courcy. Hear you not his battle cry? And I am sure I saw Elmo the page strike down an archer twice as big as himself. God send them the victory." "Hush, foolish girl, hush!" cried Isidore of the Mount, leaning her head to listen more intently. "Hark, they are coming this way. Free my bridle, soldier, free my bridle, for the love of heaven. How dare you, serf, to hold me against my will? You will repent, whoever wins." The soldier, however, heeded neither the lady's entreaties nor her threats, though it so happened that it would have proved fortunate to himself had he done so, for in a moment after, De Courcy, driven back by the superior force to which he was opposed, appeared at the turn of the wood, striking a thundering blow on the crest of one of the knights who pressed closely on him, while the 3 others spurred after at about 3 horse lengths distance. No sooner had the blow descended than the knight's quick glance fell upon Isidore. "Fly, Isidore, fly!" cried he. "You have been deceived into the power of traitors. Fly, up the path to the right, to the castle on the hill." But as he spoke, he suddenly perceived the soldier holding the rein, and forcing her horse up a bank somewhat of the current of the flight. Like lightning, De Courcy wheeled his charger, and disappointing, by the turn he took, a blow that one of his adversaries was discharging at his head, he swung his battle-axe round in the air, and hurled it with sure and unerring aim at the unhappy scout. It needed a firm heart and well-practised hand to dismiss such a fatal missile in the direction so near the person of one deeply beloved. But De Courcy had both, and rushing within 2 feet of Isidore of the Mount, the head of the ponderous axe struck the soldier full on the neck and jawbone, and dashed him from his horse, a ghastly and disfigured corpse. "Fly, Isidore, fly!" repeated De Courcy, at the same moment drawing his sword and spurring his charger furiously against the first of his opponents. "Fly up to the right, the castle on the hill, the castle on the hill." Isidore required no second injunction, but parted like an arrow from the scene of the battle, while De Courcy made almost more than mortal efforts to drive back the enemy. Though he thus gave her time to escape, his valour and skill were of course in vain, opposed to numbers not inferior to himself in personal courage, and clothed in arms equal to those by which he was defended. All he could do was to give his scattered followers time again to collect about him, and then, satisfied with having delivered Isidore, to keep up a defensive fight along the road. Even this, however, was difficult to conduct successfully in the face of a body of men so much superior to his own in numbers, eager to avenge themselves upon him, and hurried on by the knowledge that, being upon adverse ground, they must win their revenge quickly or not at all. The 4 knights pressed on him on all sides, striving to bear him down to the earth. His armour was hacked and splintered in many parts. His shield was nearly cleft in 2 with the blow of a battle-axe. Several of the bars of his visor were dashed to pieces, so as to leave his face nearly uncovered. But still he retreated slowly, with his face to his enemies, shouting from time to time his battle-cry, to cheer the spirits of his men, and striking terrible sweeping blows with his long sword whenever his opponents made a general rush upon him. One of these united attacks, however, had nearly proved fatal to the gallant young knight, for, in suddenly backing his horse to avoid it, the animal's feet struck against a felled tree, and he went down at once upon his haunches. "Arcusi! Arcusi!" cried the knight, striving to spur him up. But all 4 of his antagonists pressed upon him at once, beating him down with repeated blows, when suddenly 2 new combatants were added to the fight, Philip Augustus and the Count d'Auvergne. Both, though, as we have seen in a preceding chapter, opposed hand to hand, suddenly ceased their mutual conflict, and rushed forward to strike upon the side of de Coucy. The Count d'Auvergne, warned by his friend's well-known battle-cry, rushed, bareheaded as he was, into the midst of the struggle, and striking with all the energy of insanity, dashed at once the foremost of the young knight's opponents to the earth. The king, recognising instantly by the Norman fashion of their harness the followers of his enemy King John, sprang on his horse, and with the same chivalrous spirit that induced him in former days to attack King Richard's whole army near Courcelles, with scarce 200 knights in his own train, he cast himself in the foremost of the battle, and plied his weapon with a hand that seldom struck in vain. The struggle, by its greater equality, now became more desperate, but it was soon rendered no longer doubtful by the sight of a body of horse coming down at full speed on the road from the castle. The Normans, who had followed Guillaume de la Roche-Guyon, now hastened to effect their retreat, well knowing that whatever fresh troops arrived on the spot must necessarily swell the party of their adversaries. They made an effort, however, in the first place, to deliver their companion who had been struck down by the Count d'Auvergne, but finding it impossible, they turned their horses and retreated along the line of road over which they had advanced, only pausing for an instant at the spot where the contest had first begun, to aid William de la Roche himself, who had, as we have shown, been cast from his horse by a blow of de Coucy's battle-axe, and now sat by the roadside, somewhat stunned and dizzied by his fall, and completely plundered of his fine armour. "Ha, ha!" shouted someone from the top of one of the leafless trees hard by, as they remounted the discomfited cavalier. "Ha, ha, ha!" And in a moment Galon the Fool cast down one of the gay gauntlets on the head of its former owner, laughing till the whole cliffs rang, to see it strike him on the forehead, and deluge his fair effeminate face with blood. The Normans had not time to seek vengeance, for de Coucy's party, reinforced by the troop from the castle, hung upon their rear, and gave them neither pause nor respite till the early night, following a day in February, closed in upon the world, and fatigued with so long a strife, the pursuers drew the rein and left them to escape as they might. So fierce and eager had been the pursuit that scarce a word had passed between de Coucy's party and their new companions, till, by common accord, they checked their horses' speed. It was then that the 2 brothers-in-arms turned towards each other, each suddenly grasping his friend's hand with all the warmth of old affection. "D'Auvergne!" cried de Coucy, gazing on his friend's face, down which the blood was streaming from a wound in his temple, giving to his worn and ashy countenance in the twilight of the evening an appearance of scarcely human paleness. "De Coucy!" replied d'Auvergne, fixing his eyes on the broken bars of the young knight's helmet. "De Coucy!" he repeated, and turning away his head with a look of painful consciousness, he carried his hand to his brow, as if sensible of his infirmity, adding, "I have been ill, my friend, the hot sun of the desert, and Agnes's cold words when I delivered her father's message, a message I had sworn on my knighthood to deliver." "Ha! Then it was not," cried Philip eagerly. "But let us return to some place of repose," added he, remembering his disguise, and cutting across a topic which, besides being painful to himself, he loved not to hear canvassed near the ears of strangers. "Let us return to some place of repose. We have to thank you, Sir Knight," he added, turning to the leader of the horsemen who had joined them from the castle. "We have to thank you for your timely aid." "Not so, Beausire," replied the knight, bowing to his saddle-bow. "We were warned of the strife by a lady who claimed refuge in the castle, and we instantly came down to strike for France." "You did well," replied the king. "Hark you, Sir Knight," and approaching his horse, he spoke for some moments to him in an under voice, to which the only reply was, "You shall be obeyed." In the meanwhile, the men-at-arms and followers of De Courcy, who had paused to breathe after the first heat of the affray, began to mingle in conversation upon the events that had just taken place, and the causes which had given rise to them. And very soon all the noise and clamour of explanation and wonderment and questioning and boasting succeeded, which usually follows any very active struggle. In the course of this hubbub, De Courcy's name, situation, quality, the news he had heard concerning Guillaume de la Roche-Guyon, and the means he had taken to surprise him, and deliver the Lady Isidore, were explained to everybody whom it might concern, with that almost childish frankness and simplicity which was one of the chief characteristics of the age of chivalry. To this the king listened attentively, and then, turning to De Courcy, he said, "Sir Guy de Courcy, this adventure which you have just achieved is worthy of your other exploits. I will beg leave to ride with your train to Paris, where doubtless you are going. This good knight," he added, pointing to the leader of the troop from the castle, "informs me that the lady your good sword has delivered from that traitor Guillaume de la Roche-Guyon is in safety with the fair Queen Agnes, and," he adds, "that it is the Queen's will that no man except the garrison of the castle shall be admitted within the walls." "If such be the case, I must submit, of course," replied De Courcy, "and yet I would fain speak but a few words to the Lady Isidore, to inform her why I attacked her escort, for beyond all doubt they lured her away from the château of Moulineau upon some fine pretext." "I will take care that your conduct be rightly stated, Beausire," replied the officer; "but as to your speaking with the lady, I fear it cannot be, for the Queen will doubtless hold her both as a liege vassal of the crown and as hostage for her father's faith, and she has vowed that during her absence from our noble lord the king no man shall enter her gates, except such persons as the king himself has placed about her. Be assured, however, Sir Knight, that the lady shall receive all honourable treatment, and that your high deeds and noble prowess shall be spoken of in becoming terms." De Courcy mused a moment. "Well," he said at length, "what must be, must be. To Paris, then, for I bear the king both sad and important news." "Ha!" cried Philip, and then again remembering his disguise, he added, "Are they such as a stranger may hear?" "They are such, Sir Unknown Knight," replied De Courcy, "as will soon be heard of far and wide, but the king's ears must be the first to hear my tale. D'Auvergne," he added, turning to the count, "I pray you, let my page bind up that gash upon your temple. If I see rightly by this pale light, the blood is streaming from it still. Let him staunch it for thee, I pray." "Not so, not so, good friend," replied the count, who, while this conversation had been passing amongst the rest, had been leaning silently against an oak, with his eyes bent thoughtfully upon the ground. "Not so, it does me good. Methinks that every drop which trickles down and drops on the dust at my feet takes some of the fire out of my brain. I have been mad, I fear me, De Courcy. I am not quite right yet, but I know, I feel, that I have done this good knight some wrong. Pardon me, Sir Knight," he added, advancing to the king and extending his hand. Pardon me, as you are a good knight and true." "I do, from my soul," replied the monarch, grasping the Count's offered hand, and casting from his heart at the same moment far greater feelings of enmity than anyone present knew but himself. "I do, from my soul. But you stagger, you are faint. Bind up his wound, someone. Staunch the blood, he has lost too much already." The monarch spoke in a tone of command that soon called prompt obedience. The Count d'Auvergne's wound was instantly bound up, but before the bleeding could be stopped, he fainted, and in that state was borne to the cave from which he had first issued to attack the king. Here he was laid on a bed of moss and straw, which seemed to have formed his usual couch, and was after some difficulty recalled to animation. De Courcy, having so far seen him restored to a state of safety, burthened with the tidings of Arthur's murder, which he was eager to announce as soon as possible to the sovereign and peers of France, took leave of his unhappy friend, and leaving his page and one of his men to guard and tend him, he set out with the king on the road to Paris. 2 prisoners who had been taken, as well as one of De Courcy's followers severely wounded, were left in charge of the seneschal of the castle, who also undertook to see the rites of sepulchre bestowed on 1 or 2 of the soldiers whose lives had been sacrificed in the affray. End of chapter 7. Section 37 of Philip Augustus by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. The particulars of De Courcy's journey to Paris are not worth recording. He paused for 2 hours at a village near Moulins, with his followers and his royal companion, for the purpose of resting their weary horses, but neither of the knights took any repose themselves, though the fatigues they had undergone might well have called for it. The conduct of De Courcy somewhat puzzled the king, for it evinced a degree of calm respect towards him, which Philip judged the young knight would hardly have shown had he not recognised him by some of those signs which, when seized on by a keen and observing eye, render disguises almost always abortive. At the same time, neither by indiscreet word or meaning glance did De Courcy betray that he had any absolute knowledge of the quality of him whose limbs that plain armour covered. He spoke frankly and freely on all subjects, started various topics of conversation himself, and in short took care to bound his respect to grave courtesy, without any of that formal reverence which might have directed the attention of others to what he had observed himself. There was one, however, in the train not quite so cautious. Galon the fool, though we left him last at the top of one of the highest oaks in the wood, whither he had carried piece by piece the rich armour he had stripped from Guillaume de la Roche-Guyon, together with a well-lined pouch of chamois leather, had since taken care to rejoin the victorious party, with all his acquirements nicely bundled up on the crupper of his horse, forming a square not unlike the pack with which wandering minstrels travelled in those days. On the road he was very still and thoughtful. Whether it was that he was calculating in silence the value of his plunder, or that he was sullen from fatigue, his companions could not well tell, but when the party stopped, Galon watched his opportunity, when De Courcy was alone, gazing at the pale moon and indulging in such dreams as moonlight only yields. Stealing up to his lord, the juggler peered cunningly in his face, saying in a low voice, "Oh, Courcy, Courcy, I could show you such a trick for taming a lion." And at the same time he bent his thumb back over his shoulder, pointing to where the monarch stood at a few yards' distance. "Silence, fool," said the knight, in a deep, stern voice, adding, a moment afterwards, "What mean you, Galon?" "Did you not hear him cry, 'Denis Mountjoy, Denis Mountjoy,' when he joined the fight?" demanded Galon. "Courcy, Courcy, you might tame a lion, and you would." De Courcy caught Galon by the arm, and whispered in his ear a stern menace if he kept not silence, after which he turned at once to the king, saying aloud, "We had better to horse, fair sir, or it will be late ere we reach the city." "Ha, ha!" shouted Galon, "ha, ha!" and bounding away, he was the first in the saddle. When they were within sight of Paris, the king thanked De Courcy for the pleasure of his fair company, and saying that they should doubtless soon meet at the court, he took leave of the young knight, as if his road lay in somewhat a different direction, and rode on, his horse putting forth all his speed to reach the well-known stable. The young knight followed more slowly, and proceeding across the bridge, directed his steps to the palace on the island. In the court he found a crowd of inferior ecclesiastics with robes and stoles and crosses and banners and all the pompous display of Romish magnificence, mingled with the king's sergeants-at-arms and many a long train of retainers belonging to several of the great vassals of the crowd, who seemed to be at that moment at the court. The young knight dismounted in the midst of them, and sent in to crave an audience of the king, giving his business, as it well deserved, the character of important. A reply was soon returned, purporting that Sir Guy de Courcy was ever welcome to the King of France, and the knight was instantly marshalled to the presence chamber. Philip stood at the further extremity of the magnificent Gothic hall, a part of which still remains in the old palace of the kings of France. He was habited in a wide tunic of rich purple silk, bound round his waist by a belt of gold, from which hung his sword of state. The neck and sleeves were tied with gold, and from his shoulders descended a mantle of crimson sendal, lined throughout with ermines, which fell in broad and glossy folds upon the floor. On his head he wore a jewelled cap of crimson velvet, from under which the glossy waves of his long hair fell down in some disarray upon his shoulders. In any other man the haste with which he had changed his apparel would have appeared, but Philip, in person even, was formed to be a king, and in the easy grace of his figure and the dignified erectness of his carriage, hurry or negligence of dress was never seen, or appeared, but to display the innate majesty of his demeanour to greater advantage. He stood with one foot rather advanced, and his chest and head thrown back, while his eagle eye fixed with a keen and somewhat stern regard upon a mitred prelate, the abbot of Three Fountains Abbey, who seemed to have been speaking the moment before De Courcy entered. Gwarin the Chancellor, still in the simple dress of the Knights Hospitallers, stood beside the king, and around appeared a small but brilliant circle of nobles, amongst whom were to be seen the Dukes of Burgundy and Champagne, the Counts of Nevers and Dampierre, and the unhappy Count of Toulouse, afterwards sacrificed to the intolerant spirit of the Roman Church. "How is this?" said Philip, just as the young knight passed into the hall. "Will Rome never be satisfied? Do concessions wrung from our very heart's blood but stimulate new demands? What has Innocent III to do with the wars of Philip of France against his traitorous and rebellious vassal, John, Duke of Normandy? What pretext of clerical authority in the Church's rights has the pontiff now to show why a monarch should not in his own dominions compel his vassals to obedience, and punish crime and baseness? By the Holy Rood, there must be some new creed we have not heard of to enjoin implicit obedience in all temporal as well as spiritual things to our moderate, temperate, holy father, Innocent III, and his successors for ever. We pray thee, my lord abbot, to communicate to us all the tenets of this blessed doctrine, and to tell us whether it has been made manifest by inspiration or revelation." "You speak scornfully, my son," said the abbot mildly, "ay, and somewhat profanely. But you well know the causes that move our holy father to interfere, when he sees two christened kings wasting their blood, their treasure, and their time in vain and impious wars against each other, while the Holy Sepulchre is still the prey of miscreants and infidels, and the land of our blessed Redeemer, the land in which so many saints have died, and for which so many heroes have bled, still lies bowed down to heathens and blasphemers. You well know the causes that move him to interfere, I say, and therefore need ask no new motive for his Christian-like and holy zeal." "His Christian-like and holy zeal!" exclaimed the king, holding up his hands. "Ay, abbot," he continued, his lip curling with a bitter smile, "I do know the causes, and Christendom shall find I estimate them justly. For all answer, then, to the mild good Father Pope his exhortation of peace, I reply that Philip is King of France, and that, though I will, in all strictly ecclesiastical affairs, yield reverence and due submission to the Supreme Pontiff, yet when he dares, Abbot, to use the word command to me, in my just wars, or in the dispensation of justice unto my vassals, I shall scoff his idle threats to scorn, and, by God's will, pursue my way, as if there were neither priest nor prelate on the earth. Now, fair Sir Guy de Coucy, most welcome to Philip of France," he continued, abruptly turning away from the abbot and addressing the young knight. "We were arming even now to march to deliver you and our fair cousin Arthur Plantagenet. What cheer do you bring us from him?" "I had hoped, my liege," replied de Coucy with a pained and melancholy air, "that fame, who speeds fast enough in general to bear ill news, would have spared me the hard and bitter task of telling you what I have to communicate. He for whom you inquire is no more. Basely he has been murdered in the prisons of Rouen by his own uncle, John, King of England." Philip's brow had been cloudy before, but as the young knight spoke, fresh shadows came quickly over it, as we see storm after storm roll up over a thundery sky. At the same time, each of the nobles of France took an involuntary step forward, and with knitted brow and eager, horrified eyes, gazed upon de Coucy while he told his news. "God of heaven!" exclaimed the monarch rapidly, "what would you say? Are you very sure, Sir Knight? Not with his own hand? His nephew too? His own brother's child? As noble a boy as ever looked up in the face of heaven. Speak, Sir Knight, speak. What was the manner of his death? Have you heard? But be careful that each word be founded on certain knowledge, for on your lips hangs the fate of thousands." De Coucy related clearly and distinctly all that had occurred on the day of Arthur's murder, all that he had seen, all that he had heard. But, with scrupulous care, he took heed that not one atom of surmise should mingle with the discourse. He painted strongly, clearly, minutely, every circumstance, but he left his auditors to draw their own conclusions. The nobles of France looked silently in each other's faces, where each read the same feelings of horror and indignation that swelled in his own bosom. At the same time, the king glanced his keen eye round the circle, with a momentary gaze of inquiry at the countenances of his barons, as if he sought to gather whether the feelings of wrath and hatred which the young knight's tale had stirred up in his heart were common to all around. "Now, by the bones of the saints," cried he, "we will this day, nay, this hour, send a herald to defy that felon king, and dare him to the field. Ho, sergeant-at-arms, bid Mountjoy hither." "I have already, my lord," said de Coucy, "presumed, even before bearing you this news, to defy King John before his court, and, accusing him of this foul murder, to dare his barons, all or any who should deny the fact, to meet me in arms upon the quarrel." "Ha!" cried Philip eagerly. "What said his nobles? Did they believe your charge? Did they take up your gage, Sir Knight?" "It seems, sire," replied de Coucy, "that the tidings of the prince's murder were already common amongst the British barons, and, from what I could gather, some of their body had already charged John of Anjou with it before I came. As to my gauntlet, several of the knights stepped forward to raise it, for, to do the lords of England justice, they are never backward to draw the sword, right or wrong. But Lord Pembroke interposed, and taking up the gage, said that he would hold it in all honour till the king should have cleared himself, to their satisfaction, of the accusation which I brought against him, hinting some doubt, however, that he could do so. Nevertheless, he promised either to meet me in arms in fair field of combat, or to return my gage, acknowledging the king's quarrel to be bad." "'Tis evident enough," cried the king. "The barons of England, who are ever willing to support their monarch in any just cause," he added, with a peculiar emphasis, not exactly reproachful, but certainly intending to convey to the ears on which it fell or warning of the monarch's expectations. The barons of England are already aware of this hateful deed, or not one of them would for a moment hesitate to draw the sword in defence of his king. Poor Arthur, he continued, casting his eyes on the ground, and letting his mind wander over the past. Poor Arthur, thou wert as hopeful a youth as ever a mother was blessed withal, as fair, as engaging a boy, and now thine unhappy mother is sonless, as well widowed. I had hoped to have seated thee on the throne of thine ancestors, and to have made thy mother's heart glad in the sight of thy renewed prosperity. But thou art gone, poor child, and left few so fair and noble behind. In faith, lords, I would weep that boy's loss, continued the king, dashing a drop from his proud eye. His youth promised so splendidly, and his manhood must have proved great. Lord Abbot, he added gravely, turning to the Abbot of Three Fountains, you have marked what has passed this day, you have heard what I have heard, and if there needs any farther answer to him that sent you to preach me from my purpose of punishing a rebellious vassal, tell him that John of Anjou has added murder to treachery, and that Philip of France will never sheathe the sword till he has fully avenged the death of Arthur Plantagenet. I have indeed heard what has passed, sire, with horror and dismay, replied the abbot, but still without at all seeking to impugn the faith or truth of this good knight, whose deeds in defence of the Holy Sepulchre have been heard of by all men, and warrant his Christian truth, yet still he saw not the murder committed. Philip knit his brow and gnawed his lip impatiently, glancing his eye around the circle with a scornful and meaning smile, and muttering to himself, Roman craft, Roman craft. Whether the abbot heard it or not, he took instantly a higher tone. I irritate you, Sir King, said he, by speaking the truth, but still you must thus far hear me. The Pope, the holy head of the common Christian Church, finding himself called upon to exert all the powers entrusted to him for the deliverance of the holy city of Jerusalem, has resolved that he will compel all Christian kings to cease their private quarrels, and lay by their vindictive animosities, till the great object of giving deliverance to Christ's sepulchre be accomplished. Compel! cried Philip, the living lightning flashing from his eyes. By heaven, priest, the king he can compel to sheathe the sword of righteous vengeance out against a murderer is formed of different metal from Philip of France. So tell the pontiff. Let him cast again the interdict upon the land if he will. The next time I pray him to raise it shall be at the gates of Rome, with my lance in my hand and my shield upon my breast. My supplication shall be the voice of trumpets, and my kneeling the trampling of my war horse in the courts of the capital. What say ye, barons? Have I spoken well? Well, 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 echoed the peers around, enraged beyond moderation at the prelate's daring protection of a murderer, and at the same moment the Duke of Burgundy laid the finger of his right hand upon the pommel of his sword, with a meaning glance towards the king. Ay, Burgundy, my noble friend, thou art right, said Philip. With our swords we will show our freedom. Look not scared, Sir Abbot, but know that we are not such children as to be deceived with tales of holy wars, when the question is whether a murderer shall be punished. Away with such pretences. This war against the assassin of my noble boy, Arthur of Brittany, is my holy war, and never was one more just and righteous. Ha, Mountjoy, he added, as the King of Arms entered, we have a taste for thee, fitted for so noble a knight and so learned a herald. John of Anjou has murdered Arthur Plantagenet, his nephew, in prison. Here stands in witness thereof Sir Guy de Courcy. Good knight and noble, if ever one lived, said the herald, bowing his head to de Courcy. Go then to the false traitor John, continued the king. Defy him in our name. Tell him that we will have blood for blood, and that the death of all the thousands which shall fall in his unrighteous quarrel we cast upon his head. Tell him that we will never sheathe the sword so long as he possesses 1 foot of ground in France, and that when we have ever driven him across the bulwark of the sea, we will overleap that too, and the avenging blade shall plague him at his very hearth. Yet hold, cried Philip, pausing in the midst of the passion into which he had worked himself, and reining in his wrath to guide it in the course of his greater purposes, as a skilful charioteer bends the angry and impetuous fire of his horses to whirl him on with more energetic celerity to the goal within his view. Yet hold, and Philip carried his hand to his brow, catching, as by inspiration, the outline of that bright stroke of policy which, more than any other act of his whole reign, secured the monarchs of France the absolute supremacy of their rule. The judgment of John of Anjou, the greatest feudatory of the crown, by the united peers of France. If he made the war against John a personal one between himself and the King of England, he might be supported by his barons, and come off victorious in the struggle, it was true. But if he summoned John as Duke of Normandy to receive judgment from his sovereign court in a case of felony, it established his jurisdiction over his higher vassals on a precedent such as none would ever dare in after years to resist. It did more, for if John were condemned by his peers, of which Philip entertained not a moment's doubt, the barons of France would be bound to support their own award, and the tie between them and him would become, not the unstable one of voluntary service, rendered and refused as caprice might dictate, but a strictly feudal duty in which all would be interested to comply. Philip saw at a glance the immense increase of stability which he might give to his power by this great exercise of his rights, and clear-sighted himself, he hardly doubted that his barons would see it also, and perhaps oppose his will. Certain, however, that by the feudal system his right to summon John and judge him in his court was clear and undeniable. He resolved to carry it through at all events, but determined first to propose it to his nobles as a concession that he himself made to their privileges. What is long and tedious, as the slow eye or slower pen travels over the paper, is but the work of a moment to the mind, and Philip had in the pause of one brief instant caught every consideration that affected the idea before him, and determined upon his line of conduct. "Hold," said he to the herald. "Hold, my lords," he continued, turning to the nobles by whom he was surrounded. "In my first wrath against this base murderer, I had forgot that, though I have the indisputable right of warring upon him as a monarch, yet I cannot justly punish him as a felon, strictly speaking, without your judgment previously pronounced upon him. I would not willingly trespass upon the privileges of any of my noble vassals, and therefore, lords, you Dukes of Burgundy and Champagne, and whatever other peers of France are present, I resign the judgment of this John of Anjou into your hands. I will summon him to appear before my court of peers at the end of 20 days to answer the charges brought against him. The peers of France shall judge him according to their honour and his demerits, and I will stand by in arms to see that judgment executed." The peers of France could hardly have refused to assist at the trial to which Philip called them, even had they been so willed; but, far behind the monarch in intellect, and indignant at the baseness of John of Anjou, they now eagerly expressed their approval of the king's determination, and again plighted themselves to support him in his war against the English sovereign, whether that war was maintained as a consequence of the judgment they should give, or as a continuation of that which they had already commenced. The herald, then, was instantly dispatched to Rouen for the purpose of displaying the articles of accusation against John at the court of Normandy, and of summoning him to appear on the 20th day at Paris to answer the charges to be there substantiated. At the same time, the legate of the Holy See, very well convinced that, in the present case, the thunders of the church would fall harmless at the feet of Philip, though launched with ever so angry a hand, took leave of the monarch with a discontented air, and as he left the hall the monarch's lip curled, and his eye lighted with a foretaste of that triumph which he anticipated over the proud priest who had so darkly troubled the current of his domestic happiness. "Beau Sire de Coucy," said the king, turning to the young knight with a bland smile, as he recalled his thoughts from the contemplation of the future. "Notwithstanding the sad news you have brought us, you are most welcome to the court of France. Nor will we fail to repay your sufferings as far as our poor means will go. In the meanwhile, we beg of you to make our palace your home till such a time as, with sounding trumpets and lances in rest, we shall march to punish the assassin of Arthur Plantagenet. Then shall you lead, to aid in the revenge I know you thirst to take, all the fair host raised on the lands of the Count de Tancarville, full 1,000 archers and 200 knights. At supper, noble lords," continued the king, "I trust that all here will grace my board with their presence. Ere then I have a bitter task to perform, to break to a fond mother the death of her noble boy, and to soothe the sorrows of a helpless widow." End of chapter 8. Section 38 of Philip Augustus by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. One unchanging cloud of perpetual sorrow lowered over the days of the unhappy Agnes de Meranie. The hope that the council which had been called to decide upon the king's divorce might pronounce a judgment favourable to her wishes dwindled gradually away, till its flickering, uncertain light was almost more painful than the darkness of despair. The long delays of the Church of Rome, the tedious minutiae of all its ceremonious forms, the cavillings upon words, the endless technicalities, however sweet and enduring was her disposition, wore her mind and her frame, and she faded away like a rose at the end of summer, dropping leaf by leaf towards decay. She delighted no longer in things wherein she had most joyed. The opening flowers of the spring, the chanting of the wild melodious birds, and reviving glow of all nature's face after the passing of the long chill winter brought her no happiness. Her heart had lost its young expansion. Her eyes were covered with a dim, shadowy veil that gave its own dull, sombre hue to all that she beheld. Her ears were closed against every sound that spoke of hope, or pleasure, or enjoyment. Her life was one long, sad dream, overjoys passed away, and happiness never to return. For many and many an hour she would wander about through the woods, but when she saw the young green leaves opening out from the careful covering with which nature had defended their infancy, she would recall the time when, with her beloved husband, she had watched the sweet progress of the spring, and would weep to find him no longer by her side, and to see in the long cold future an unchanging prospect of the same dull vacancy. Often, too, she would stray to the top of one of the high hills near the castle, and, gazing over the wide extended view, the sea of woods waving their tender green heads below her, the mingling hills and valleys and plains beyond, the windings of the broad river with the rich, rich vale through which it flows, and the distant gleams of towers and spires scattered over the fair face of the bright land of France, she would sigh as she looked upon the proud kingdom of her Philip, and would quickly shrink back from the wide extension of the scene to the small limit of her heart's feelings and her individual regrets. She shrunk, too, from society. Her women followed, but followed at a distance, for they saw that their presence importuned her, and it was only when any message arrived from the king, or any news was brought concerning the progress of his arms, that they broke in upon her reveries. Then indeed Agnes listened, as if her whole soul was in the tale, and she made the narrators repeat over and over again every small particular. She heard that one castle had fallen, that another district had submitted, that this baron had come over to the crown of France, or that city had laid its keys at the feet of Philip, dwelling on each minute circumstance, both of warfare and of policy, with as deep and curious an interest as if her life and hope had depended on the issue of each particular movement. It was remarked, too, that the oftener the name of Philip was repeated in the detail, the more interest she appeared to take therein, and the more minute was her questioning, and if any eminent success had attended his arms, it would communicate a gleam of gladness to her eyes that hardly left them during the whole day. At other times she spoke but little, for it seemed to fatigue her, and though from the blush of her cheek, which every evening seemed to come back brighter and brighter, and from a degree of glistening splendour in her eye, which grew more brilliant than it had ever been in her happier days, her women augured returning health, yet her strength visibly failed, and that lovely hand, whose small but rounded symmetry had been a theme for half the poets of France, grew pale and thin, so that the one loved ring nearly dropped from the finger round which it hung. It was not from a love of new things or new faces, for no one was more constant in all her affections than Agnes de Meranie, but though she avoided even the society of her own immediate followers, several of whom had attended upon her in her own land, yet Isidore of the Mount, from the time she had taken refuge in the castle where she was still detained by royal order, was often welcomed by the Queen with a smile that the others could not win. Perhaps the secret was that Isidore never tried to console her, that she seemed to feel that the name of comfort under such circumstances was but a mockery, and though she strove, gently and sweetly, to divert the mind of the unhappy princess from the immediate subject of her grief, she did it by soft degrees, and never sought for a gaiety that she did not feel herself, and which she saw was sadly discordant with all the feelings of the Queen when affected by others in the hope of pleasing her. One morning, towards the end of March, on entering the apartments of the Queen, Isidore found her with her head bent over her hand, and her eyes fixed upon the small circle of gold that had bound her to Philip Augustus, while drop after drop swelled through the long lashes of her eyelids and fell upon the ring itself. Seeing that she wept, Isidore was about to retire, for there is a sacredness in grief such as hers that a feeling heart would never violate. The Queen, however, beckoned her forward, and looking up, wiped the tears away. "One must be at a sad pitch of fortune, Isidore," said she, with a painful smile at her own melancholy conceit. "One must be at a sad pitch of fortune when even inanimate things play the traitor and leave us in our distress. This little magic symbol," she continued, laying one finger of the other hand upon the ring, "this fairy token, that in general is destined to render two hearts happy or miserable, according to the virtue of the giver and the receiver, it has fallen from my finger this morning, though it has been my comfort through many a sorrow. Is not that ominous, Isidore?" "Of nothing evil, I hope, lady," replied Isidore. "Trust me, 'tis but to show that it will be put on again under happier auspices." "'Twill be in heaven, then," replied Agnes, fixing her eyes on the thin fair hand which lay on the table before her. "'Twill be in heaven, then. Do you too deceive yourself, lady? Isidore, Isidore, the canker worm of grief has not only eaten the leaves of the blossom, it has blasted it to the heart. I would not die if I could avoid my fate, for it will give Philip pain. But for me, lady, for me, the grave is the only place of peace. Care must have made some progress ere that ring, round which the flesh once rose up, as if to secure it for ever as its own, would slip with its own weight to the ground." Isidore bent her head and was silent, for she saw that to speak of hope at that moment would be worse than vain. "I had been trying," said the Queen, clinging to the subject with a sort of painful fondness, "I had been trying to write something to Constance of Brittany that might console her for the loss of her poor boy Arthur. But I blotted many a page in vain, and found how hard it is to speak one word of comfort to real grief. I know not whether it was that my mind still selfishly turned to my own sorrows, and took from me the power of consoling those of others, or whether there is really no such thing as consolation upon earth. But still, as I wrote, I found each line more calculated to sadden than to cheer. At last I abandoned the task, and letting my hand, which had held the paper, drop beside me, This faithless pledge of as true a love as ever bound two hearts dropped from my finger and rolled away from me. Oh, Isidore, 'twas surely an evil omen. But it was not that which made me weep. As I put it on again, I thought of the day that it had first shone upon my hand, and all the images of lost happiness rose up around me, like the spectres of dead friends, calling me to join the past. And oh, how the bright and golden forms of those sunny days contrasted with the cold, hard sorrow of each hour at present. Oh, Isidore, 'tis not the present, I believe, that ever makes our misery. 'Tis the contrast with the past. 'Tis the loss of some hope, or the crushing of some joy, the disappointment of expectation, or the regrets of memory. The present is nothing, 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 but in its relation to the future or the past. How painful, then, must be that contrast to the poor Duchess of Brittany, said Isidore in reply, taking advantage of the mention that the Queen had made of Constance, to lead her mind away from the contemplation of her own griefs. How bitter must be her tears for that gallant young Prince Arthur, when all France is weeping for him. Not a castle throughout the land but rings, they say, with the tale of his murder. Not a bosom but beats with indignation against his assassin. I have just heard that Sir Guy de Courcy, who was his fellow prisoner, defied John Lackland in the midst of his barons, and cast down his gauntlet at the foot of the very throne. The messenger, she added, casting down her eyes as the Queen raised hers, for there came a certain tell-tale glow into the cheek as she spoke of de Courcy, that she did not care to be remarked. The messenger you sent to the canon of Saint-Bert's has but now returned, bringing news from Paris concerning the court of peers held upon the murderer, and affirming that he has refused to appear before the barons of France. At least, so says my girl Eleanor. The news of Arthur's death and various particulars concerning it had spread in vague rumours to every castle in France. Many and various were the shapes which the tale had assumed, but of course it had reached Agnes de Meranie and her suite in somewhat of a more authentic form. All that concerned Philip in any way was of course a matter of deep interest to her. Isidore's plan for withdrawing her mind for the moment from herself had therefore its full effect, and she instantly directed the messenger to be brought to her, for the purpose of learning from him all that had occurred at the Court of Peers, to which assembly, however, we shall conduct our reader in his own person. End of Chapter 9. Section 39 of Philip Augustus by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. To those who have not studied the spirit of the feudal system, it would seem an extraordinary and almost inconceivable anomaly that one sovereign prince should have the power of summoning to his court and trying as a felon another of dominions scarcely less extensive than his own. But the positions of vassal and lord were not so incoherent or ill-defined as may be imagined. Each possessor of a fief, at the period of his investiture, took upon himself certain obligations towards the sovereign under whom he held, from which nothing could enfranchise him as far as that fief was concerned, and upon his refusing or neglecting to comply with those obligations, the territory enfeoffed or granted returned in right to what was called the capital lord, or him, in short, who granted it. To secure, however, that even justice should be done between the vassal and the lord, each equally an interested party, it became necessary that some third person or body of persons should possess the power of deciding on all questions between the other two. Thus it became a fundamental principle of the feudal system that no vassal could be judged but by his peers, that is to say, by persons holding in the same relative position as himself from the same superior. For the purpose of rendering these judgments, each great baron held, from time to time, his court, composed of vassals holding directly from himself, and in like manner the King's Court of Peers was competent to try all causes affecting the feudatories who held immediately from the crown. John, therefore, was summoned to appear before the court of Philip Augustus, not as King of England, which was an independent sovereignty, but as Duke of Normandy and Lord of Anjou, Poitou, and Guyenne, all fiefs of the crown of France. No one, therefore, doubted the competence of the court, and John himself dared not deny its authority. It was a splendid sight, the palace of the Louvre, on the morning appointed for the trial. Each of the great barons of France, anxious that none of his peers should outvie him in the splendour of his train, had called together all his most wealthy retainers, and presented himself at the court of the king, followed by a host of knights and nobles, clothed in the graceful flowing robes worn in that day, shining with gold and jewels, and flaunting with all the gay colours that the art of dyeing could then produce. Silks and velvets, and cloths of gold and silver, contended in gorgeous rivalry in the courts and antechambers of the palace. Flags and pennons, banners and banderols fluttered on the breeze, while all the most beautiful horses that could be procured were led in the various trains by the pages and squire, unmounted, as if their graceful forms were too noble to bear even the burden of a prince. In the great hall itself the scene was more solemn, but scarcely less magnificent. Around, in the midst of all the gorgeous decorations of the royal court on its day of solemn ceremony, sat all the highest and noblest of France, clothed in those splendid robes of ermine, which, independent of any associations of their value, from the very snowy whiteness and the massy folds into which that peculiar fur falls, gives an idea of majesty and grandeur that no other dress can convey. Each bore upon his coroneted brow the lines of stern and impressive gravity, for all deeply felt how solemn was the occasion on which they had met, how terrible was the cause of their assembly, and how mighty would be the consequences of their decision. The feeling was near akin to awe, and many of the younger peers scarcely seemed to breathe, lest they should disturb the silence. In the centre, surrounded by all the insignia of royalty, upon a throne raised several steps above the hall, and covered by a dais of crimson and gold, sat Philip Augustus, a monarch indeed in mind, in person, and in look. There was a simple bandlet of gold around his brows, raised with fleurs-de-lis, and jewelled with fine, uncut stones, but the little distinction which existed between it and the coronets of his peers would have hardly marked the sovereign. Though personal appearance, however, is indeed no sign of dignity, either of mind or station, yet Philip Augustus was not to be mistaken. There was royalty in his eye and in his carriage. The custom of command shone out in every line, and though there were many noble and princely persons present, there was none like him. On the king's left hand stood Mountjoy, King-at-Arms, holding a scroll containing the appeal of Constance, Duchess of Brittany, to the peers of France for the punishment of John, called unjustly, it went on to state, King of England, for the murder of Arthur Plantagenet, his nephew and born sovereign, her son. On the right stood De Courcy, neither armed nor clothed in his robes as peer, though, however small his territories, their being free and held under no one, gave him such a right. But being there as the chief accuser of John, he sat not of course amongst those called to judge him. Several of the peers' seats were vacant, and before proceeding to the immediate business on which the court had met, various messengers were admitted to offer the excuses of the several barons who, either from want of power or inclination, were not present in person. The apology of most was received as sufficient, but at the names of several the king's brow darkened, and he turned a meaning look to his chancellor, Guerin, who stood at a little distance. When this part of the ceremony was concluded, Philip made a sign to the King of Arms, who, having waved his hand to still a slight murmur that had been caused by the admission of the messengers, proceeded to read the petition of Constance of Brittany, and then, followed by a train of heralds and marshals, advanced to the great doors of the hall, which were thrown open at his approach, and in a loud voice summoned John, Duke of Normandy, to appear before the peers of France, and answer to the charge of Constance, Duchess of Brittany. 3 times he repeated the call as a matter of ceremony, and between each reiteration the trumpets sounded, and then gave a pause for reply. At length, after a brief conversation with some persons without, the heralds returned, introducing 2 persons as deputies for John, who, as everyone there already knew, was not and would not be present. The one was a bishop, habited in his pontifical robes, and the other the well-known Hubert de Burgh. "Sir Deputies, you are welcome," said the king, as the 2 Normans advanced to the end of the table in the centre of the hall. "Give us the cause why John of Anjou does not present himself before his peers to answer the charges against him. Say, is he sick to the death, or does he dare deny the competence of my court?" "He is neither sick, sire," replied the bishop, "nor does he, as Duke of Normandy, at all impugn the authority of the peers of France to judge upon all questions within the limits of this kingdom." Philip's brow relaxed. "But," continued the bishop, "before trusting himself in a city and a land where he has many and bitter enemies, he demands that the King of France shall guarantee his safety." "Willingly," replied Philip. "Let him come. I will warrant him from harm or from injustice." "But will you equally stake your royal word?" demanded the bishop, fixing his eyes keenly on the king, as if he feared some deceit. "Will you stake your royal word that he shall return safely to his own land?" "Safely shall he return," replied the king, with a clear, marked, and distinct voice, "if the judgment of his peers permit him so to do." "But if the peers condemn him," asked the bishop, "will you give him a safe conduct?" "No, by the Lord of heaven and earth," thundered the king. "No, if his peers condemn him, he shall suffer the punishment his peers award, should they doom him to the block, the cord, or the wheel. Their sentence shall be executed to the letter." "You well know then, sire king," replied the bishop calmly, "that John, King of England, cannot submit himself to your court. The realm of England cannot be put at the disposition of the barons of France, by its king submitting to their judgment. Neither would our English barons suffer it." "What is that to me?" cried Philip. "Because my vassal, the Duke of Normandy, increases his domains, do I, as his sovereign, lose my rights? By heaven's host, no. Go, heralds, to the courts, and the bridges, and the highways, and summon John of Anjou to present himself before his peers. Sir Bishop, you have done your embassy, and, if you stay but half an hour, you shall hear the judgment of our court, on the cause of which we have met to take cognizance." The bishop, however, and his companion took their leave and departed, the bishop bowing low in reverence to the court, and the stout Hubert de Burgh turning away after a calm, careless glance round the peers of France, as if he had just concluded a piece of needless ceremony, of which he was heartily tired. For a moment or 2 after the deputies were gone, the barons continued to converse together in a whisper, while Philip sat without speaking, glancing his quick, keen eye from one countenance to another, as if he would gather beforehand the terms of the judgment they were afterwards to pronounce. Gradually, complete silence began again to spread itself over the court, one baron after another dropping the conversation that he held with his neighbour, till all was still. There is always something awful in very profound silence, but when the silence of expectation on any great occasion has been prolonged for any extent of time, it becomes a sort of painful charm, which requires no small resolution to break. Thus the peers of France, when once the stillness had completely established itself, sat without word or motion, waiting the return of the heralds, awed by the very quiet, though many of the more timid and undecided would fain have asked counsel of those next whom they sat, had they dared to break the spell that seemed to hang over the assembly. Many a vague doubt and many a fear attached itself to the duty they were called upon to perform, for even in that day it was no small responsibility to set a world in arms, and renew that deluge of bloodshed that had so lately ceased. From time to time, under the influence of these feelings, the several peers gazed in the countenances of their fellows, to see if they were shaken by the same hesitations as themselves. But it is ever the bold that lead, and here and there, scattered through the assembly, might be seen a face that turned to no one for advice or support, but with the eyes fixed on the ground and the brow bent, and the lips closed, seemed to offer a picture of stern determined resolution. It was these men who decided the deliberations of the day, for their opinions all waited, and all voices followed their lead. At length the doors of the hall were again thrown open, and Mountjoy, King-at-Arms, presented himself, informing the court that he had summoned John of Anjou, Duke of Normandy, in the courts, on the bridges, and the highways, and that he did not appear. There was now a deep pause, and Philip turned his eyes to the Duke of Burgundy. He was a man of a dull, saturnine aspect, stout even to corpulency, with shaggy eyebrows overhanging his dark eyes, but with a high, finely formed nose, and small, well-shaped mouth, so that his countenance was stern without being morose, and striking without being handsome. The great baron rose from his seat while there was a breathless silence all around, and laying his hand upon his heart, he said in a clear, stern tone, "I pronounce John of Anjou guilty of murder and disloyalty. I hold him a cruel and perverse traitor, and I declare that for these crimes his fiefs of Normandy, Anjou, Poitou, Maine, and Guyenne are justly forfeited to his sovereign lord, and he himself worthy of death upon my honour." A murmur of approbation succeeded, for a great proportion of the barons had already determined upon a similar judgment, and those who had remained undecided were glad of someone with whose opinion to establish their own. One after another now rose, and notwithstanding all the hesitation which many had felt the moment before, there was not one dissenting voice from the condemnation pronounced by the Duke of Burgundy. Had there been any strong mind to oppose, half the peers would have followed him like a flock of sheep, but there was none, and they now all eagerly and almost turbulently pronounced judgment against John of Anjou, sentencing him unanimously to forfeiture of all his fiefs, and every pain inflicted on high felony. The silence was succeeded by a babble of tongues perfectly extraordinary, but the moment after the voice of the king was heard above the rest, and all was again hushed. What would in the present day smack of stage effect was in perfect harmony with the manners, habits, and feelings of those times, when a spirit unknown to us, a moving principle whose force is now exhausted, or only felt even feebly in the breasts of a few, the spirit of chivalry impelled men to everything that was singular and striking. Philip rose majestically from his throne, drew his sword from the scabbard, and advancing to the table, laid the weapon upon it naked. Then, gazing round the peers, he exclaimed, to arms, nobles of France, your judgment is pronounced. 'Tis time to enforce it with the sword. To arms, I lose no moments in vain words. Call together your vassals. Philip of France marches to execute your sentence against John of Anjou, and he calls on his barons to support their award. The day of meeting is the 10th from this, the place of Monstre, beneath the walls of Château Galliard. Let cowards leave me, and brave men follow me, and I will punish the traitor before a year be out." So saying, he waved his hand to his peers, and followed by the heralds and men-at-arms, left the hall of assembly. The younger and less clear-sighted of the peers eagerly applauded Philip's brief appeal, but there was in fact a tone of triumph in it which struck the more deep-thinking barons, and perhaps made them fear that they had that day consecrated a power which might sooner or later be used against themselves. Doubt kept them silent, however, and they separated at once, to prepare for the campaign before them. Philip Augustus lost no time. Scarcely had the herald carried to John of England the news of his condemnation by the Court of Peers, than every part of his dominions in France were invaded at once with an overpowering force. Disgusted with his baseness, his treachery, and his levity, the barons of England afforded him but little aid, and the nobles of his French dominions, in most instances, yielded willingly to the King of France, who offered them friendship and protection on which they could rely. The greater towns, indeed, of Maine and Normandy still held for John, and made some show of resistance, but what by superior force and skill in war, and what by politic concessions, before 2 months were over the major part had been led to submit to Philip. The war was of course begun, as was ever the case in those days, by hordes of plunderers of every description, who, on the very first call to arms, inundated Normandy, pillaging, ravaging, and destroying, sparing neither sex nor age, and by their excesses driving the people to submit willingly to the authority of the French monarch, who alone could afford them any sufficient protection. To the towns Philip held out the promise of being rendered free communes under royal charters. To the barons he offered security in all their rights and privileges, and to the people peace and safety. With these offers, and the sight of their accomplishment wherever they were accepted, on the one hand, and an immense and conquering army on the other, it is not at all wonderful that triumph should follow everywhere the royal standard of France. John fled timidly to Guyenne, while the Earl of Salisbury, with small and inefficient forces, endeavoured in some degree to check the progress of the French monarch. Battles there were none, for the inequality of the two armies totally prevented William Longsword from hazarding anything like a general engagement, but sieges and skirmishes succeeded each other rapidly, and De Courcy had now the opportunity of drinking deep the cup of glory for which he had so long thirsted. At the head of the retainers of the Count de Tancarville, which formed as splendid a leading as any in the army, he could display those high military talents which had always hitherto been confined to a narrower sphere. He did not neglect the occasion of doing so, and in castle and in bower, throughout all the land of France, wherever great deeds were spoken of, there was repeated the name of Sir Guy de Courcy. In the meanwhile, still confined to the castle of Rolleboise, Isidore of the Mount heard from day to day of her lover's feats of arms, and though she often trembled for his safety, with those timid fears from which a woman's heart, even in the days of chivalry, was never wholly free, yet, knowing the impulse that carried him forward, and proud of the affection that she had inspired and that she returned, whenever the name of the young knight was mentioned, her eye sparkled and her cheek glowed with love, and hope, and expectation. Her father, she thought, after the base attempt made to carry her off by William de la Roche-Guyon, of the particulars of which she was now fully aware, would never press her to wed so base a traitor, and who stood so fair to win the place that he had lost as Guy de Courcy. Thus whispered hope. Fear, however, had another discourse, and perhaps she listened as often to the tale of the one as the other. During this time the Count d'Auvergne had recovered from the wound he had received, and under the care of his own attendants, who, by the clue afforded by De Courcy, had regained him, soon acquired new strength, at least of body. It was remarked, however, that, though while suffering excessive exhaustion from loss of blood, his mind had been far more clear and collected, yet in proportion as he recovered his corporeal vigour, his intellectual faculties again abandoned him. His followers, who, notwithstanding the cold sternness of his manners, loved him with true feudal attachment, kept a continual watch upon him, but it was in vain that they did so. With a degree of cunning, often joined to insanity, he contrived to deceive all eyes, and once more made his escape, leaving not a trace by which he could be followed. Such was the situation of all the personages concerned in this history towards the end of the month of June, when suddenly the Earl of Salisbury, with the handful of men who had accompanied him, ceasing to hover round the king's army, harassing it with continued skirmishes, as had been his custom, disappeared entirely, leaving all Normandy open and undefended. 1,000 vague reports were instantly circulated through the camp, but the only correct one was that which was brought to the king's tent, as he sat writing after the march of the morning. "Well," cried Philip, as one of his most active scouts was ushered into his presence, "what news of the Earl of Salisbury? No more 'I believes.' Give me some certainty." "My lord," replied the man, "I am now sure, for I saw the rear guard of his army in full march towards Boulogne. Mocking the jargon of the Normans, I spoke with some of the men, when I found that the whole host is bound for Flanders." "Ha! So soon!" cried the king. "I knew not that they were so far prepared." But to explain the king's words, we must turn to the events which had been going on without the immediate limits of France, and which, while he was striding from victory to victory within his own dominions, threatened to overwhelm him by the combination of his external enemies, with all his discontented vassals. End of chapter 10. Section 40 of Philip Augustus by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. During the wars in Normandy and Maine, John had been absent, but not inactive, and what by his single power he could not bring about, he resolved to accomplish by coalition. Many causes of enmity towards Philip Augustus existed amongst all the monarchs by whose territories his kingdom was surrounded, and not less amongst his own immediate vassals. And John at once saw that his only hope of ever regaining the fiefs that Philip had wrested from him was in joining his own power with those of every enemy of the French monarch, and hurling him, by their united efforts, from the throne. The English sovereign found no opposition to these schemes of policy. Otto, Emperor of Germany, had met in Philip an unceasing and irreconcilable adversary. Philip it was who had principally opposed his election. Philip it was who had raised candidate after candidate against him. Philip it was who had taken advantage of his late quarrels with the irritable Pope, and had, even after his coronation, thrown in a rival, and placed the greater part of the Upper Germany in the hands of Frederick of Sicily. Otto, therefore, thirsted for vengeance, and the proposal of a general confederacy against the French monarch but fulfilled his hopes and anticipated his efforts. Ferrand, Count of Flanders, was not less easily won to join the coalition. One of the greatest vassals of the crown of France, with territories more extensive than the royal domain itself, he had ever been jealous of Philip's increasing power, and had, by many a breach of his feudal duties, endeavoured to loosen the tie that bound him to his sovereign. By the example of John, however, he now began to see that such breach of duty would not pass unpunished. Views of ambition, too, joined themselves to hatred and fear. He saw prospects of independence, of sovereignty, and immense territorial aggrandizement as the infallible consequence of Philip's overthrow, and he therefore was one of the first to put his name to the confederation. So great an alliance once established, thousands of minor princes joined themselves to it, eager to share the spoil. The Dukes of Brabant and Lemberg, the Counts of Holland, Nemours, and Boulogne, whether vassals of the King of France or not, all found some motive to unite against him, and some excuse to their own conscience for throwing off the homage they had vowed. In the meantime, the disaffection of Philip's vassals in the heart of his kingdom was great and increasing. The immense strides which the monarchical power had taken under his guidance, the very vast increase of authority they had themselves cast into his hands by their judgment against John, the extensive increase of absolute domain, which his prompt and successful execution of that judgment had given him, made each baron tremble for his own power, while at the same time Philip's protection of the communes, his interference in matters of justice and general right, and the appeal he granted in his court as supreme lord against the decisions of his great vassals, made each also tremble for the stability of the feudal system itself. John took care to encourage discontent and apprehension. 1,000 rumours were spread concerning Philip's views and intentions. Some declared that his ambitious mind would never be at peace till he had re-established the empire of Charlemagne, till he had broken the power of the barons, and wrested from their hands the administration of justice in their territories. Some said that his plans were already formed for throwing down their strongholds and possessing himself of their lands, and there was not, indeed, a report, however extravagant, that could irritate the fears and jealousies of the nobles of France against their king, that was not cunningly devised and industriously circulated. Some believed, and some pretended to believe, and nothing was heard of, from all parts of the kingdom, but preparations for revolt. In the meanwhile, Philip was, as we have already shown, steadily pursuing his operations against John, the more anxious for success because he knew that one defeat would at once call the storm upon his head. He suffered himself not to be turned from the business he had in hand by threatenings of any kind, having secured what he considered sufficient support amongst the barons to repel his external enemies and punish internal rebellion. He saw, too, with that keen sagacity which was one of his peculiar qualities, that passions were beginning to mingle themselves in the confederacy of his enemies, which would in time weaken their efforts, if not disunite them entirely. These passions were not those doubts and jealousies of each other which so often overthrow the noblest alliances, but rather that wild and eager grasping after the vast and important changes which can only be brought about by the operation of many slow and concentring causes. The designs of the confederates spread as they found their powers increase. Their first object had been but to make war upon Philip Augustus. Perhaps even the original proposal extended but to curb his authority and reduce him to the same position with his predecessors. Gradually, however, they determined to cast him and his race from the throne, and calculating upon the certainty of success, they proceeded by treaty to divide his dominions amongst them. Otto was assigned his part, John his, and Ferrand of Flanders claimed Paris and all the adjacent territory for himself. All laws and customs established by Philip were to be done away, and the feudal system restored, as it had been seen a century and a half before. Various other changes were determined upon, but that which was principally calculated to destroy their alliance was the resolution to attack the power of the Church, and to divide its domains amongst the barons and the knights. John had felt the lash of a papal censure, and though the ecclesiastical authority had been exercised for the purpose of raising Otto to the imperial throne, he also had since experienced the weight of the Church's domination, and had become inimical to the sway by which he had been formerly supported. Nothing then was spoken of less than reducing the power of Rome, and seizing on the luxurious wealth of the clergy. Innocent the Pope heard and trembled, and, though he the very first had laid the basis of the confederacy against the French monarch, he now saw consequences beyond it that made him use every effort to stop it in its career. But it was in vain. The hatreds he raised up against Philip in his own dominions, the fears he had excited, and the jealousies he had stimulated, were now producing their fruits, and a bitter harvest they promised against himself. At the same time, as he contemplated the approaching struggle, which was hurrying on with inconceivable rapidity to its climax, he beheld nothing but danger from whatever party might prove victorious. Over the King of France, however, he fancied he had some check, so long as the question of his divorce remained undecided, and consequently the usual doubts and hesitations of the Church of Rome were prolonged even beyond their ordinary measure of delay. The Confederation had not been so silent in its movements but that the report thereof had reached the ears of Philip Augustus. Care had been taken, however, that the immediate preparations should be made as privately as possible, so that the first intimation that the troops of the coalition were actually in the field against him was given by the movement of the Earl of Salisbury upon Flanders. After that moment, however, post after post came thick as hail, announcing the various motions of the allies. 150,000 men of all nations and arms were already assembled on the banks of the Scheldt. John of England was in arms in Poitou, and more than 20 strong places had submitted to him without a stroke. Otto's imperial banner was given to the wind, and fresh thousands were flocking to it every hour, as if his very Gothic name had called together the myriads of the north to a fresh invasion of the more civilized world. At the same time, revolt and disaffection were manifest through every district of Languedoc, and some of the nearest relations and oldest friends of the French monarch swelled the ranks of his enemies. Such were the tidings that every courier brought, and such were the forces that threatened to overwhelm the kingdom of France and overthrow its throne. It would be vain to say that Philip Augustus saw such a mighty combination against him without alarm, but it was not the alarm of a weak and feeble mind, which yields to difficulties or shrinks from danger. No sooner did he hear the extent to which his enemy's preparations had been carried, an extent which he had not fully anticipated, than he issued his charter, convoking the bons and arrière-bons of France to meet at Soissons, and calling to his aid all good men and true throughout his dominions. Though far inferior in number to his enemies, the force he mustered was anything but insignificant. Then appeared the gratitude of the communes towards the king who had enfranchised them. By their charters they were bound to furnish a certain number of armed men in times of need, but on this occasion there is every reason to believe that they far exceeded their quota. Nor were the nobles and the knights a few who presented themselves at the Monstre at Soissons. Seldom had France shown so brilliant a display of chivalry, and even their inferiority of number was more than compensated by their zeal and their renown in arms. First passed before the monarch, as he sat on his battle-horse surrounded by the troops of his own domains, his faithful vassal, Eudes, Duke of Burgundy, followed by all his vassals, vavasseurs, and knights, with a long train of many thousand archers and men-at-arms from all the vast lands of his kingly dukedom. Next came Thibaut of Champagne, yet in his green youth, but accompanied by his uncle Philip, and a contingent of knights and soldiers that was an army in itself. Then succeeded the counts of Dreux, Auxerre, Ponthieu, and Saint-Pol, each with a long train of men-at-arms. De Coucy leading the troops of Tancarville, the lords of Montmorency and Malvoisin, Saint-Valery, Mareuil, and Roye, with the Viscount of Melun and the famous Guillaume de Bar followed after, while the troops willingly raised by the clergy and the long trains of archers and men-at-arms furnished by the free cities completed the line, and formed an army of more than 80,000 men, all bedecked with glittering banners and dancing plumes, which gave the whole that air of splendour and pageant that excites enthusiasm and stimulates hope. The king's eyes lightened with joy as he looked upon them, and conscious of his own great powers of mind to lead to the best effect the noble host before him, he no longer doubted of victory. Now, said he in his own breast, as he thought of all that the last few years had brought, the humiliation that the Pope had inflicted on him, the agony of his parting from Agnes, the vow that had been extorted from him not to see her till the council had pronounced upon his divorce, if its sentence should be given within 6 months, the long delays of the Church of Rome, which had now nearly protracted its deliberations beyond that period, the treason which the proceedings of Innocent had stirred up amongst his vassals, mingled with the memory of torn affections and many bitter injuries. Now it shall be my turn to triumph, Agnes. I will soon be thine, or in the grave. And let me see the man, prelate, or prince, who, when I have once more clasped thy hand in mine, shall dare to pluck it thence. Now, now, he murmured, now the turn is mine. Detaching a part of his new-raised army to keep in check the forces of King John in Poitou, Philip Augustus, without a moment's delay, marched to meet the chief body of the Confederates in Flanders. All the horrors of a great and bloody warfare soon followed the bodies of plunderers and adventurers that went before the army, burning, pillaging, and destroying everything, as they advanced beyond the immediate territories of the king. Nothing was beheld as the army advanced, but smoking ruins, devastated fields, and the dead bodies of women and children, mingled with the half-consumed carcasses of cattle, and the broken implements of industry and domestic comfort. It was a piteous and sad sight to see all the pleasant dwellings of a land laid waste, the hopes of the year's labours all destroyed, and the busy human emmets that had there toiled and joyed, swept away as if the wing of a pestilence had brushed the face of the earth, or lying murdered on their desolate hearths. Philip Augustus, more refined than his age, strove to soften the rigours of warfare by many a proclamation against all useless violence. But in that day such proclamations were in vain, and the very unsheathing of war's flaming sword scorched up the land before it struck. In the meanwhile, the imperial forces, now swelled to more than 200,000 men, marched eagerly to meet the king, and about the same time each army arrived within a few miles of Tournay. Both chieftains longed for a battle, yet the ardour of Philip's forces was somewhat slackened since their departure from Soissons. Ferrand of Flanders and his confederates had contrived with infinite art to seduce some of the followers of the French monarch, and to spread doubt and suspicion over many others, so that Philip's reliance was shaken in his troops, and most of the leaders divided amongst themselves. Such continued the doubtful state of the royal army when Philip arrived at Tournay, and heard that the emperor, with all his forces, was encamped at the village of Mortain, within 10 miles of the city. But still the king resolved to stake all upon a battle, for though his troops were inferior, he felt that his own superior mind was a host, and he saw that, if the disaffection which was reported really existed amongst his barons, delay would but increase it in a tenfold degree. The evening had come, all his preparations were over, and he had summoned his barons to council in an hour, and, sitting in a large chamber of the old castle of Tournay, Philip had given order that he should not be disturbed. He felt, as it were, thirst for calm and tranquil thought. The last few months of his existence had been given up to all the energy of action. His reflections had been nothing but eternal calculation, the combination of his own movements, the anticipation of his enemies, plans of battle and policy, and all the thousand momentary anxieties that pressed upon the general of a large and ill-organised army. He had thought deeply and continually, it is true, but he had not time for thoughts of that grand and extensive nature that raise and dignify the mind every time they are indulged. Though Agnes, too, was still the secret object that gave life and movement to all his energies, though he loved her still with that deep, powerful love that is seldom permitted to share the heart with ambition, though she, in fact, was his ambition's object, and though the battle to which he strode would, if won, place in his hand such power that none should dare to hold her from him, yet he had scarcely hitherto had an instant to bestow on those calmer, sweeter, gentler ideas, where feeling mingles with reflection, and relieves the mind from petty calculation and workday cares. There are surely two distinct parts linked together in the human soul, feeling and thought. The thought that receives, that separates, that investigates, that combines; the feeling that hopes, that wishes, that enjoys, that creates. Philip Augustus, however, felt a thirst for that calm reflection wherein feeling has the greater share, and, covering his eyes with his hands, he now abandoned himself to it altogether. The coming day was to be a day of bloodshed and of strife, a day that was to hurl him from a throne, or to crown him with immortal renown, to leave him a corpse on the cold field of battle, or to increase his power and glory, and restore him to Agnes. He thought of it long and deeply. He thought of what would be Agnes's grief if she heard that her husband, that her lover, had fallen before his enemies, and he wrung his own heart by picturing the agony of hers. Then again came brighter visions. Hope rose up, and grew into expectation, and he fancied what would be her joy when, crowned with the laurel of victory, and scoffing to shame the impotent thunder of the Roman Church, he should clasp her once more in his arms, and bid her tread upon the necks of her enemies. Ambition perhaps had its share in his breast, and his thoughts might run on to conquest yet to come, and to mighty schemes of polity and aggrandizement, but still Agnes had therein a share. In the chariot of victory, or on the imperial throne, imagination always placed her by his side. His dream was interrupted by a quick step, and the words, "My lord?" and uncovering his eyes, he beheld Guerin advancing from behind the tapestry that fell over the door. "What now, Guerin?" cried the king, somewhat impatiently. "What now?" "My lord," replied the minister, "I would not have intruded, but that I have just seen a fellow who brings tidings from the enemy's camp of such importance I judged that you would willingly give ear to it yourself." "Knowest thou the man?" demanded Philip. "I love not spies." "I cannot say with any certainty that I have before seen him, sire," replied Guerin, "though I have some remembrance of his face. He says, however, that he was foot-servant to Prince Arthur, who hired him at Tours, and he gives so clear an account of the taking of Mirabeau and the subsequent disasters, that there is little doubt of his tale. He says, moreover, that being taken there with the rest, Lord Salisbury has kept him with him since, to dress one of his horses, till, finding himself so near the royal army, he made his escape like a true man." "Admit him," said the king. "His tale is a likely one." Guerin retired for a moment, and then returned, with a bony, powerful man, whose short-cut hair, long beard, and mustachios offered so different an appearance to the face of anything like a Frenchman in those days, that Philip gazed on him with some doubts. "How, fellow?" cried he. "Thou art surely some Polack, no true Frenchman, with thy beard like a hermit's, and thy hair like a hedgehog." The man's tongue, however, at once showed that he claimed France for his country justly, and his singular appearance he accounted for by saying it was a whim of the Earl of Salisbury. "Answer me then," said the king, looking upon him somewhat sternly. "Where were your tents pitched in the enemy's camp? You will find I know their forces as well as you, and if you deceive me you die." "The tents of the Earl of Salisbury are pitched between those of the Count of Holland and the troops of the Emperor, so please you, sire," replied the man boldly. "I came to tell you the truth, not to deceive you." "You have spoken truth in one thing at least," replied the monarch. "One more question," he continued, looking at some notes on the table. "One more question, and thou shalt tell thy tale thy own way. What troops lie behind those of the Duke of Brabant, and what are their number?" "The next tents to those of the Duke of Brabant," replied the man, "are those of the Duke of Lorraine, amounting, they say, in camp, to 900 knights and 7,000 men-at-arms." "Thou art right in the position, fellow, and nearly right in the number," replied the king. "Therefore I will believe thee. Now repeat the news that you gave to that good knight." "May it please you, sire," replied the man, with a degree of boldness that amounted almost to affectation, "late last night a council was held in the tent of the Emperor, and the Earl of Salisbury chose me to hold his horse near the entrance of the tent, for he is as proud an Englishman as ever buckled on spurs, and though all the other princes contented themselves with leaving their horses on the outside of the second guard, he must needs ride to the very door of the tent, and have his horse held there till he came out." "By my faith, 'tis like their island pride," said the king. "Each Englishman fancies himself equal to a prince. But proceed with thy tale, and be quick, for the hour of the council approaches." "My story is a very short one, sire," replied the man, "for it was but little I heard. However, after they had spoken within the tent for some time in a low voice, the Emperor's tongue sounded very loud, as if some one had opposed him, and I heard him say, 'He will march against us, whatever be the peril. I know him well. And then at the narrow passage of Damaré we will cut them off to a man. For Sir Guy de Coucy has promised to embarrass their rear with the men of Tankerville, and he will keep his word too," cried the Emperor loudly, as if some one had seemed to doubt it, "for we had promised him the land of his lady-love, the daughter of Count Julian of the Mount, if we win the victory." "Ha!" cried the king, turning his eyes from the countenance of the informer to that of Gwerin. "Ha! This is treason indeed. Said they aught else, fellow, that you heard?" "They spoke of there being many traitors in your host, sire," replied the man, "but they named none else but Sir Guy de Courcy. And just then I heard the Earl of Salisbury speak as if he were walking to the mouth of the tent. 'If Philip discovers his treason,' said he will cut off his head, and then your plan is naught.' Just as he spoke he came out, and seeing me stand near the tent, he bade me angrily go further off, so that I heard no more." "Have Sir Guy de Courcy to prison," said the king, turning to Gwerin. "By the Holy Rood, we will follow the good Earl of Salisbury's plan, and have one traitor less in the camp." As he heard these words, the eyes of the informer sparkled with a degree of joy that did not escape the keen and observing glance of the king. But wishing to gain more certain knowledge, he thanked him with condescending dignity for the news he had given, and told him to wait amongst the sergeants of arms below, till the council should be over, when the chancellor would give him a purse of gold as a reward for his services. The man, with a low reverence, retired. "Follow, Gwerin," replied Philip hastily. "Bid some of the sergeants look to him narrowly, but let them treat him well. Lead him to Babel, if it be possible. However, on no account let him escape. Have this de Courcy to prison too, though I doubt the tale." Gwerin turned to obey, but at that moment the pages from without opened the doors of the chamber, giving entrance to the barons who had been called to the council. A moment of bustle succeeded, and by the time that Gwerin could quit the king, the man who had brought the information we have just heard was gone, and nowhere to be found. So suspicious a circumstance induced Gwerin to refrain from those strong measures against de Courcy which the king had commanded, till he had communicated with the monarch on the subject. He sent down, however, to the young knight's quarters to require his presence at the castle on business of import, when the answer returned by his squires was, that de Courcy himself, his squire, Hugo de Bar, who had by this time been ransomed by his lord, his page, and a small party of lances, had been absent ever since the encampment had been completed, and no one knew whither they had gone. Gwerin knit his brows, for he would have staked much upon de Courcy's honour, but yet his absence at so critical a moment was difficult to be accounted for. He returned to Philip instantly, and found the council still in deliberation, some of its members being of opinion that it would be better to march directly forward upon Mortain and attack the enemy without loss of time, and others again strongly counselling retreat upon Péronne. Many weighty arguments had been produced on both sides, and at the moment Gwerin entered, a degree of silence had taken place previous to the king's pronouncing his final decision. Gwerin, however, approached the monarch, and bending beside him, informed him in a low voice of what he had just heard. The king listened, knitting his brows and fixing his eyes upon the table, till Gwerin had concluded. Then raising his head and thinking for a moment, without taking any immediate notice of what the minister had said, he announced his decision on the point before the council. "Noble lords," said he, "we have heard and weighed your opinions upon the conduct of the war, but various circumstances will induce us in some degree to modify both, or, rather, to take a medium between them. If we advance upon the enemy at Mortain, we expose ourselves to immense disadvantage in the narrow passage of Dameray. This consideration opposes itself on the one hand, and on the other, it must never be said that Philip of France fled before his enemies, when supported by so many true and faithful peers as we see around us here." And the monarch glanced his eagle eye rapidly from face to face, with a look which, without evincing doubt, gathered at once the expression of each as he spoke. "Our determination, therefore, is, early to-morrow morning, to march as if towards Lille, and, the next day, wheeling through the open plains of that country, to take the enemy on their flank, before they are aware of our designs. By dawn, therefore, I pray ye, noble peers, have your men all arrayed beneath your banners, and we will march against our enemy, who, be assured, whatever fair promises he holds out, is not alone the enemy of Philip, but of every true Frenchman. You are fighting for your hearths and for your homes, and where is the man that will not strike boldly in such a quarrel? For to-night, lords, adieu. To-morrow we will meet you with the first ray of the sun." With these words the councils broke up, and the barons took their leave and withdrew, some well contented with the king's plan, some murmuring that their opinion had not been conceded to, and some perhaps disappointed with the scheme that threatened failure to the very confederacy against which they appeared in arms. "'Tis strange, Gwerin, 'tis strange," cried the king, as soon as his peers were gone. "We have traitors amongst us, I fear, yet I will not believe that De Courcy is false. His absence is unaccountable, but, depend on it, there is some good cause. And yet that groom's tale against him, 'tis strange. I doubt some of the faces, too, that I have seen but now. But I will try them, Gwerin, I will try them, and if they be traitors, they shall damn themselves to hell." As the king had commanded, with the first ray of the sun the host was under arms, and stretching out in a long line under the walls of Tournay, it offered a gay and splendid sight, with the horizontal beams of the early morning shining bright on 1,000 banners and flashing back from 10,000 lances. The marshals had scarcely arrayed it 5 minutes, when the king, followed by his glittering train, issued forth from the castle, mounted on a superb black charger, and armed cap à pie. He rode slowly from one end of the line to the other, bowing his plumed helmet in answer to the shouts and acclamations of the troops, and then returned to the very centre of the host. Circling round the crest of his casque was seen the golden fleur-de-lis of the crown of France, and it was remarked that behind him 2 of his attendants carried an immense golden wine-cup called a hanap, and a sharp naked sword. In the centre of the line the king paused, and raised the volant piece of his helmet, when his face might be seen by everyone, calm, proud, and dignified. At a sign from the monarch, 2 priests approached, carrying a large silver cruse and a small loaf of bread, which Philip received from their hands, and cutting the bread into pieces with the edge of the sword, carried by his attendant, he placed the pieces in the chalice, and then poured it full of wine. "Barons of France," cried he in a loud voice, which made itself heard to an immense distance, "Barons of France, some foul liar last night sent me word that there were traitors in my council and rebels in my host. Here I stand before you all, bearing on my casque the crown of France, and if amongst you there be one man that judges me unworthy to wear that crown, instantly let him separate from my people and depart to my enemies. He shall go free and unscathed, with his arms and followers, on the honour of a king. But those noble barons who are willing to fight and to die with their sovereign, in defence of their wives, their children, their homes, and their country, let them come forward, and in union with the king eat this consecrated bread and taste this sacred wine. And cursed be he who shall hereafter forget the sign of unity and fellowship." A loud shout from the whole host was the first reply, and then each baron, without an exception, hurried forward before the ranks, and claimed to pledge himself as Philip had proposed. In the midst of the ceremony, however, a tall strong man in black armour pushed his way through the rest, exclaiming, "Give me the cup! Give me the cup!" When it was placed in his hands, he raised it first to his head without lifting the visor of his helmet, but finding his mistake, he unclasped the volant hurriedly, and throwing it back, discovered the wild countenance of Count Thibault d'Auvergne. He then raised again the cup, and with a quick but not ungraceful movement, bowed low to Philip, and drank some of the wine. "Philip, King of France, I am yours till death," he said when he had drunk, and after gazing for a few moments earnestly in the king's face, he turned his horse and galloped back to a large body of lances, a little in the rear of the line. "Unhappy man," said the king, and turning to Gwerin, he added, "Let him be looked to, Gwerin. See who is with him." On sending to inquire, however, it was replied that the Count d'Auvergne was there with his vassals and followers to serve his sovereign Philip Augustus in his wars, as a true and faithful liegeman. Satisfied, therefore, that he was under good and careful guidance, the king turned his thoughts back to other subjects, and having briefly thanked his barons for their ready zeal, commanded the army to begin its march upon Lille. End of chapter 11. Section 41 of Philip Augustus by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Between Mortain and Tournay, in a small road with high banks on either side, the shrubs and flowers of which were covered with a thick coating of dust, rode two of our old acquaintances on the same morning that the review we have just described took place in the army of the king. At first, armed in aubergine and casque, with his hisorical or gorget hiding his long beard, and his helmet covering his short-cut hair, it was no longer difficult to recognise as Jodelle the Brabançois, whom we last saw in an assumed character before Philip Augustus. By his side, more gaudily costumed than ever, with a long peacock's feather ornamenting his black cap, rode Galon the Fool. Though two persons of such respectability might well have pretended to some attendance, they were alone, and Jodelle, who seemed in some haste, and not particularly pleased with his companion's society, was pricking on at a sharp pace. But Galon's mare, on which he was once more mounted, had been trained by himself, and ambled after the cotterel's horse with a sweet sort of pertinacity from which there was no escaping. "Why follow you me, fool, devil?" cried the Brabançois. "Get thee gone. We shall meet again, fear not. I am in haste, and my curse upon those idiot Saxons that let you go, when I charged them to keep you, after you hunted me all the way from your camp to ours last night." "Ha, ha!" cried Galon, showing all his white sharp teeth to the very back, as he grinned at Jodelle. "Ha, ha! Thou art ungrateful, Sire Jodelle. Ha, ha! To think of a cotterel being ungrateful. Did not I let thee into all Coucy's secrets 2 days ago? Did I not save thy neck from the hangman 5 months ago? And now, thou ungrateful hound, thou grudgest me thy sweet company. Ha, ha! I that love thee, ha, ha, ha! I that enjoy thy delectable society, ha, ha! Ha, ha! Ha, ha!" And he rolled and shouted with laughter, as if the very idea of any one loving the Brabançois was sufficient to furnish the whole world with mirth. "So thou toldest thy brute Saxons to keep me, or hang me, or burn me alive if they would, last night. Ay, and my bonny mare too, saying it was as great devil as myself. Ha, ha! Maître Jodelle, they told me all, but they fell in love with my phiz, and let me go, all for the sweetness of my countenance. Who can resist my wondrous charms?" And he contorted his features into a form that left them the likeness of nothing human. "But I'll plague thee," he continued. "I'll never leave thee till I see what thou dost with that packet in thy bosom. I'll tease thee. I have plagued the Coucy enough for a blow he gave me one day. That I have. Now methinks I'll have done with that, and do him some good service." "Thou'lt never serve him more, fool," cried Jodelle, his eyes gleaming with sanguinary satisfaction. "I have paid him too for the blow he gave me, and for more things than that. His head is off by this time, juggler. I heard the order given myself. Ay, and I caused that order. Ha! Canst thou do a feat like that?" "Ha, ha! Ha, ha, ha!" screamed Galon, wriggling his snout hither and thither, and holding his sides with laughter. "Ha, ha! Thou dolt! Thou ass! Thou block! Thou stump of an old tree! By the Lord, thou must be a wit after all, to invent such a piece of uncommon stupidity. Ha, ha, ha! Ha, ha! Didst thou think that I would have furnished thee with a good tale against the Coucy, and given thee means of speech with the Chancellor himself, without taking care to get the cowl-killing, hammer-fisted homicide out of the way first? Ha, ha, thou idiot! Ha, ha, ha! Lord, what an ass a cotterel is! Ha, ha, ha!" "Not such an ass as thou dreamest, fiend," muttered Jodelle, setting his teeth close, and almost resolved to aim a blow with his dagger at the juggler as he rode beside him. But Galon had always one of his eyes, at least, fixed upon his companion, and in truth Jodelle had seen so much of his extraordinary activity and strength that he held Galon in some dread, and scarcely dared to close with him in fair and equal fight. He had smothered his vengeance for long, however, and he had no inclination to delay it much longer, as the worthy Brabançois had more reasons than one for resolving to rid himself of the society of a person so little trustworthy as Galon, in the most summary manner possible. But the only question was how to take him at a disadvantage. For this purpose it was necessary to cover every appearance of wrath, that the juggler might be thrown off his guard. Jodelle smoothed his brow therefore, and after a moment affected to join in Galon's laugh. "Thou art a cunning dealer," said he. "Thou art a cunning dealer, Sir Galon. But in troth, I should like to know how thou didst contrive to beguile this de Coucy away from the army, as thou sayest, at such a moment." "Ha, ha!" cried Galon. "Ha, ha! 'Twas no hard work. How dost thou catch a sparrow, Sir Jodelle? Is it not by spreading out some crumbs? Well, by the Holy Rood, as he says himself, I sent him a goose's errand all the way down to the river, to reconnoitre a party of men whom I made Elmo the page, make Hugo the squire, make Coucy the knight, believe they were going to take the king's host on the flank. Ha, ha! Oh, rare! By St. Peter, thou hast betrayed what I told thee when we were drinking 2 nights since," cried Jodelle. "Fool, thou wilt have my dagger in thee if thou heedest not." "Oh, rare!" shouted Galon. "Oh, rare! What then, did I tell the Coucy true, when I said Count Julian of the Mount and William de la Roche-Guyon were there with 10,000 men? Ha, ha! Did I tell them true, Cotterell? Talk not to me of daggers, lout, or I'll drive mine in under thy 5th rib, and leave thee as dead as a horse's bones on a common. Ha, ha! I thought the Coucy would have gone down with all the men of Tankerville, and have chimed me, that fair-faced coward, that once fingered this great monument of my beauty." And he laid his finger on his long unnatural snout, with so mingled an expression of face that it was difficult to decide whether he spoke in vanity or mockery. "But he only went down to reconnoitre," added the juggler. "The great ninny! He might have swallowed father and lover up at a mouthful, and then married the heiress if he had liked. And he calls me fool too. Oh, rare! But where art thou going, beau Sire Jodelle? I saw all your army afoot before I left them to come after you, and I dreamed that they were going to cut off the king at the passage by Bovine. And doubtless thou art bearer of an order to Sir Julian and Count William, with the Duke of Limburg and the men of Ardennes, to take him at the rear. Oh, there will be fine smashing of bones and hacking of flesh. I must be there to have the picking of the dead men." Thus ran on Galon, rambling from subject to subject, but withal betraying so clear a knowledge of all the plans of the imperial army, that Jodelle believed his information to be little less than magical, though indeed Galon was indebted for it to strolling amongst the tents of the Germans the night before, and catching here and there, while he amused the knights and squires with his tricks of jongleury, all the rumours that were afloat concerning the movements of the next day. From these, with a happiness that madness sometimes has, he jumped at conclusions which many a wiser brain would have missed, and, like a blind man stumbling on a treasure, hit by accident upon the exact truth. As his conversation with Jodelle arrived at this particular point, the road which they were pursuing opened out upon a little irregular piece of ground, bisected by another bypath, equally ornamented by high, rough banks. Nevertheless, neither of these roads traversed the centre of the little green or common, the one which the travellers were pursuing skirting along the side, under the sort of cliff by which it was flanked, and the other edging the opposite extreme. At the intersection of the paths, however, at the very top of the farther bank, stood a tall elm tree, which Galon measured with his eye as they approached. "Ah, ah!" cried he, delighting in every recollection that might prove unpleasant to his neighbours. "Ha, ha! Beau Sire Jodelle, monstrous like the tree on which they were going to hang you near the Pont de l'Arche. Ha, ha, ha! The time when you were like to be hanged, and I saved you. You remember?" "Thou didst not save me, fool," replied the Brabançois. "'Twas King John saved me. I would not owe my life to such a foul fool as thou art, for all that it is worth. The king saved my life to do a great deed of vengeance, which I will accomplish yet before I die," added Jodelle, "and then I'll account with him too for what I owe him. He shall not be forgot. No, no." And the plunderer's eyes gleamed as he thought of the fate that the faithless monarch had appointed for him, and connected it with the vague schemes of vengeance that were floating through his own brain. "Haw, haw," cried Galland, "if thou goest not to hell, Sire Jodelle, thou art sure 'twill not be for lack of thanklessness, to back your fair bevy of gentlemanly vices. John the Gentle sent thee thy pardon, that thou mightest murder De Courcy for prating of his murdering Arthur. I know that as well as thou dost, but had my tongue not been quicker than his messenger's horse, thou wouldst soon have been farther on your road to heaven than ever you may be again. Oh, rare! How the crows of the Pont d'Arche must hate me! Haw, haw, vinegar face! Didst ever turn milk sour with thy sharp nose? Hark! Hear you not a distant clatter? Your army is marching down towards the bridge, Prince Pumpkin," he rambled on. "I'll run up yon tree and see, for this country is as flat as pease porridge." So saying, Galland sprang to the ground, climbed the bank in an instant, and walked up the straight bole of the tree, as easily as if he had been furnished with a ladder. Giving a quick glance round, however, every step, to see that Jodelle did not take advantage of him. His movements had been so rapid that with the best intentions thereunto in the world, the cotterel could not have injured him in his ascent, and when he was once up, he began to question him on what he saw. "What do I see?" said Galland. "Why, when I look that way, I see German asses, and Lorraine foxes, and English curs, and Flanders mules, all marching down towards the river as quietly as may be. And when I look the other way, I perceive a whole band of French monkeys tripping on gaily without seeing the others. And when I look down there," he continued, pointing to Jodelle, "I see a Provençal wolf, hungry for plunder and thirsty for blood." And Galland began to descend the tree. As he had spoken, there was a sound of horses heard coming up the road, and Jodelle spurred close up under the bank, as if to catch a glance of the persons who were approaching. But at the same moment he quietly drew his sword. Galland instantly perceived his manoeuvre, and attempted to spring up the tree once more. Ere he could do so, however, Jodelle struck at him, and though he could only reach high enough to wound the tendon of his leg, the pain made the juggler let go his hold, and he fell on top of the bank, nearly on a level with the face of the cotterel, who, rising in his stirrups, with the full lunge of his arm, plunged his sword into his body. Though mortally wounded, Galland, without word or groan, rolled down the bank, and clung to the legs of his enemy's horse, impeding the motions of the animal as much as if it had been clogged, while at the same time Jodelle now urged it furiously with the spur, for the sound of coming cavaliers and the glance of a knight's pennon from behind the turn of the road, at about 100 yards distance, showed him that he must either ride on or take the risk of the party being inimical to his own. 3 times the horse, plunging furiously under the spur, set its feet full on the body of the unfortunate juggler, but still he kept his hold, without a speech or outcry, till suddenly shouting, "Haw, haw, 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 the Courcy, the Courcy, haw, haw," he let go his hold, and the cotterel galloped on at full speed, ascertaining by a single glance that Galland's shout announced nothing but the truth. De Courcy's eyes were quick, however, and his horse far fleeter than that of the cotterel. He saw Jodelle and recognised him instantly, while the dying form of Galland, and the blood that stained the dry white sand of the road in dark red patches round about, told their own tale, and were not to be mistaken. Without pausing to clasp his visor or to brace his shield, the knight snatched his lance from his squire, struck his spurs into the flanks of his charger, and before Jodelle had reached the other side of the little green, the iron of the spear struck him between the shoulders, and passing through his plastron, as if it had been made of parchment, hurled him from his horse, never to mount again. A shrill cry, like that of a wounded vulture, as the knight struck him, and a deep groan as he fell to the ground, were the only sounds that the plunderer uttered more. De Courcy tugged at his lance for a moment, endeavouring to shake it free from the body, but finding that he could not do so without dismounting, he left it in the hands of his squire, and returned to the spot where Galon the Fool still lay, surrounded by part of the young knight's train. "Courcy! Courcy!" cried the dying juggler in a faint voice. "Galon is going on the long journey. Come hither and speak to him before he sets out." The young knight put his foot to the ground and came up close to his wounded follower, who gazed on him with wistful eyes, in which shone the first glance of affection, perhaps, that ever he had bestowed on mortal man. "I am sorry to leave thee, Courcy," said he. "I am sorry to leave thee, now it comes to this. I love thee better than I thought. Give me thy hand." De Courcy spoke a few words of kindness to him, and let him take his hand, which he carried feebly to his lips, and licked it like a dying dog. "I have spited you very often, Courcy," said the juggler, "and do you know I am sorry for it now, for you have been kinder to me than anyone else. Will you forgive me?" "Yes, my poor Galon," replied the knight. "I know of no great evil thou hast done, and even if thou hast, I forgive thee from my heart." "Heaven bless thee for it," said Galon. "Heaven bless thee for it. But hark thee, De Courcy, I will do thee one good turn before I die. Give me some wine out of the bouteille, mad Elmo the page, and I will tell De Courcy where I have wronged him, and where he may right himself. Give me some wine, quick, for my horse is jogging to the other world." Ermold, as he was desired, put the leathern bottle, which every one travelled with in those days, to the lips of the dying man, who, after a long draught, proceeded with his confession. We will pass over many a trick which he acknowledged to have played his lord in the Holy Land, at Constantinople, and in Italy, always demanding between each, "Can you forgive me now?" De Courcy's heart was not one to refuse pardon to a dying man, and Galon proceeded to speak of the deceit he had put upon him concerning the lands of the Count de Tancarville. "It was all false together," said he. "The vidame of Besançon told me to tell you that his friend, the Count de Tancarville, had sent a charter to be kept in the king's hands, giving you all his fiefs, and now, when he sees you with the army, commanding the men of Tancarville, the vidame thinks that you are commanding them by your own right, not out of the good will of the king. Besides, he told me he did not know whether your uncle was dead or not, but that Bernard, the hermit of Vincennes, could inform you." "But why did you not—" demanded De Courcy. "Ask me no questions, Courcy," cried Galon. "I have but little breath left, and that must go to tell you something more important still. From the top of yon tree I saw the king marching down to the bridge at Beauvais, and without his knowing it, the enemy are marching after him. If he gets half over, he is lost. I heard Henry of Brabant last night say that they would send a plan of their battle to the Duke of Limburg, Count Julian, and William de la Roche-Guyon, whose troops I sent you after, down the river. He said, too," proceeded Galon, growing apparently fainter as he spoke, "he said, too, that it was to be carried by one who well knew the French camp. Oh, Courcy, my breath fails me. Jodelle, the Cotterel, he is the man, I am sure. The papers are on him. But Courcy, Courcy," he continued, gasping for breath and holding the knight with a sort of convulsive grasp, as he saw him turning to seek the important packet he mentioned. "Do not go, Courcy. Do not go to the camp. They think you a traitor. Oh, how dim my eyes grow. They will have your head off. Don't go. You'll be of no use with the head off." "Ha, ha, ha, ha!" And with a faint effort at his old wild laugh, Galon the Fool gave one or two sharp shudders, and yielded the spirit, still holding De Courcy tight by the arm. "He is gone," said the knight, disengaging himself from his grasp. "Our army marching upon Beauvais," continued he. "Can it be true? They were not to quit Tournay for 2 days. Up, Aylmo, into that tree, and see whether you can gain any sight of them. Quick, for we must spur hard if it be true. You, Hugo, search the body of the Cotterel. Quick, Aylmo, hold by that branch there, your foot on the other. See you anything now?" With some difficulty, Armand de Marcy, though an active youth, had climbed halfway up the tree that Galland had sprung up like a squirrel, and now, holding round it with both legs and arms, he gazed out over the far prospect. "I see spears," cried he. "I see spears marching on by the river, and I can see the bridge too." "Are there any men on it?" cried de Coucy. "How far is it from the foremost spears?" "It is clear yet," replied the page, "but the lances in the van are not half a mile from it." "Look to the right, look to the right," cried the knight, "towards Mortain. What see you?" "I see a clump or two of spears," replied the youth, "scattered here and there, but over one part that seems a valley there rises a cloud. It may be the morning mist, it may be dust. Stay, I will climb higher." And he contrived to reach 2 or 3 branches above. "Lances, as I live!" cried he. "I see the steel heads glittering through the cloud of dust, and moving on, just above the place where the hill cuts them. They are rising above the slope. Now they dip down again, thousands on thousands. Never did I see such a host in Christendom or Paynemery." "Come down, Armand, and mount," cried the knight. "2 of the servants of arms, take up yon poor fellow's body," he continued, "and bear it to the cottage where we watered our horses but now. Then follow towards the bridge with all speed. Now, Hugo, hast thou the packet? 'Tis it, by the Holy Rood," he added, taking a sealed paper that the squire had found upon Jodelle. To horse, to horse! We shall reach the king's host yet, ere the van has passed the bridge. He must fight there or lose all." And followed by the small body of spears that accompanied him, Guy de Coucy spurred on at full gallop towards the bridge of Bovines. The distance might be about 4 miles, but ere he had ridden one half of that way, he came suddenly upon a body of about 20 spears, at the top of a slight rise that concealed each party till they were within 50 yards of the other. "Down with your lances," cried de Coucy. "France, France, à Coucy, à Coucy!" And in an instant the spears of his followers, to the number of about 70, were levelled in the long straight row. "France, France!" echoed the other party, and riding forward, de Coucy was met in mid-space by the Chancellor Guerin, armed at all points, but bearing the coat and cross of a knight hospitaller, and Adam Viscount de Melun, who had together ridden out from the main body of the army to ascertain the truth of some vague reports that the enemy had left Mortain, and was pursuing with all his forces. "Well met, Sir Guy de Coucy," said Guerin. "By your cry of France but now, I trust you are no traitor to France, though strange accusations against you reached the king last night, and your absence at a moment of danger countenanced them. I have order," he added, "to attach you for treason." "Whosoever calls me traitor lies in his teeth," replied the knight rapidly, eager to arrive at the king's host with all speed. "My absence was in the king's service; and as to attaching me for treason, Lord Bishop," he added with a smile, "methinks my 70 lances against your 20 will soon cancel your warrant. I dreamed not that the king would think of marching to-day, being Sunday, or I should have returned before. But now, my lord, my errand is to the king himself, and 'tis one also that requires speed. The enemy are following like hounds behind the deer. I have here a plan of their battle. They hope to surprise the king at the passage of the river. He must halt on this side, or all is lost. From that range of low hills, most likely you will see the enemy advancing. Farewell." Guerin, who never for a moment doubted the young knight's innocence, did not of course attempt to stay him, and de Coucy once more galloped on at full speed. He soon began to fall in with stragglers from the different bodies of the royal forces, camp followers, plunderers, skirmishers, pedlars, jugglers, cooks, and all the train of extraneous living lumber attached to an army of the 13th century. From these he could gain no certain information of where the king was to be found. Some said he had passed the bridge, some said he was yet in the rear; and finding that they were all as ignorant on the subject as himself, the young knight sped on, and passing by several of the thick battalions which were hurrying on through clouds of July dust towards the bridge, he demanded of one of the leaders where was the king. "I heard but now that he was in that green meadow to the right," replied the other knight. "And see," he added, pointing with his lance, "that may be he, under those ash trees." De Courcy turned his eyes in the direction the other pointed, and perceived a group of persons, some on horseback, some on foot, standing round one who, stretched upon the grass, lay resting himself under the shadow of a graceful clump of ash trees. Close behind him stood a squire, holding a casque in his hand, and another, at a little distance, kept in the ardour of a magnificent battle-horse that, neighing and pawing the grass, seemed eager to join the phalanx that defiled before him. It was evidently the king who lay there, and De Courcy, bringing his men to a halt at the side of the high road along which the rest were pressing, troop after troop towards the bridge spurred on, followed by his squires alone, and rode up to the group at once. Philip Augustus raised his eyes to De Courcy's face as he came up, and at a few paces the young knight sprang from his horse, and casting his rein to Hugo de Bar, approached the monarch. "My lord," said he earnestly as soon as he was within hearing, "I beseech you to order a halt, and command your troops who have passed the bridge to return. The enemy are not half a mile from you, and before half the army can pass you will be attacked on all sides." De Courcy spoke rapidly, and the king answered in the same manner. "Sir Guy de Courcy," said he, without rising, however, "you are accused to me of treason. Ought I to listen to counsel from a man in that situation?" "My lord the king," replied the knight, "God send you many such good traitors as I am. There is the enemy's plan of attack, at least so I believe, for I have not opened it. You will see by the seal it is from the Duke of Brabant, and by the superscription that it is to the Duke of Limburg, together with Count Julian of the Mount, and Count William de la Roche-Guyon, his allies. I reconnoitred their forces last night. They amount to 15,000 men, and lie 3 miles down the river." The king took the paper and hastily cut the silk with his dagger. "Halt!" cried he, after glancing his eye over it. "Marois de Malvoisin, command a halt. Ho, Guerin!" he cried, seeing the minister riding quickly towards him. "Have you seen the enemy?" "They are advancing with all speed, sire," shouted the hospitaller as he rode up. "For God's sake, sire, call back the troops. They are coming up like the swarms of locusts we have seen in Palestine. Their spears are like corn in August." "We will reap them," cried Philip, starting up with a triumphant smile upon his lip. "We will reap them. To arms, warriors, to arms!" And putting his foot in the stirrup, he stood with his hand upon the horse's neck, turning to those about him, and multiplying his orders with the prompt activity of his keen, all-grasping mind. "The Oriflamme has passed the bridge. Speed to bring it back, Renaud. Hugo, to the Count of St. Pol. Bid him return with all haste. De Courcy, I did you wrong. Forget it and strike this day as you are wont. Guerin, array the host as we determined. See the faithful communes be placed in our own battle, but let Arras and Amiens hold the second line. Let the barons and the knights stretch out as far as may be. Remember, every man's own lance and shield must be his safeguard. Eustache, speed to the Count de Beaumont. Bid him repass the river at the ford, and take his place at the right. Now, Guerin, hasten. Let the sergeants of Soissons begin the battle, that the enemy may be broken ere the knights charge. Away, De Courcy, lead Tancarville well, and win the day. Guillaume de Mortemar, stay by our person." Such were some of the orders given by Philip Augustus. Then, springing on his horse, he received his casque, and, raising the visor, sat in silence gazing upon the field, which was clear and open on all sides, except the road, through which the troops were still seen approaching towards the bridge, and which, in the other direction, wound away towards Tournay, through some small woods and valleys that hid the rear guard from view. In the meanwhile, Guerin, whose long experience as a knight hospitaller qualified him well to marshal the army, hastened to array all the troops that had yet arrived on the plain, taking care to keep the entrance of the bridge free, that the forces which had already passed and were returning upon their steps might take up their position without confusion and disarray. At that moment a messenger arrived in breathless haste from the rear of the army, stating that the enemy were already engaged with the light troops of Auxerre, who sustained themselves with difficulty and demanded help. But even while he spoke, the 2 bodies engaged issued forth upon the plain, and the spears of the whole imperial army began to bristle over the hills. The trumpets of the French sounded as their enemies appeared, and it seemed that the Emperor was not a little surprised to find his adversary so well prepared to meet him. Whether the unexpected sight of so large a body of troops drawn up to oppose them embarrassed the Confederates and deranged their plans, or whether Philip's first line covering the bridge they did not perceive that a great part of his forces were still either on the other side of the river or engaged in repassing it, cannot now be told, but they took no advantage of so favourable a moment for attack. The body engaged with the rear of Philip's army was called back, and wheeling to the right of the road by which they came, they took up their position on the slope of the hills to the north of the plain, while Philip eagerly seized the opportunity of displaying his forces on the southern side, thus having the eyes of his soldiers turned away from the burning sun, that shone full in the faces of the adverse host. An army commanded by many chiefs is, of course, never well led, but what may be gained by consultation is ever lost by indecision, and the two great faults thus committed by the Confederates were probably owing to the uncertainty of their counsels. However that may be, they suffered Philip greatly to recover the unity of his forces and to take up the best position on the field, after which succeeded a pause, as if they hesitated to begin the strife, though theirs had been the party to follow and to urge their enemy to a battle, and though they had overtaken him at the precise moment which they had themselves planned, and in which an attack must have proved the most disastrous. End of chapter 12. Section 42 of Philip Augustus by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. For several minutes after the two armies were thus ranged opposite each other, both stood without motion, gazing on the adverse host. The front line was composed almost entirely of cavalry, which formed in those days the great strength of an army, and uniformly decided the event of a battle. But between the long battalions of the knights and men-at-arms were ranged close bodies of crossbowmen and archers, who waited but a signal to commence the engagement with their missiles. Standing thus face to face, with but a narrow space between them, the two hosts seemed as if contemplating the glittering array of the field, which, if we may believe the branch of royal lineages, offered on either part as splendid a pageant as ever a royal court exhibited on fête or tournament. There, it says in its naïve jargon, you might see many a pleasant coat of arms, and many a neat and gentle device, tissued of gold and various shining colours, blue, vermilion, yellow, and green. There were to be seen serried shields, and neighing horses, and ringing arms, pennons and banners, and helms and glittering crests. To the left of the imperial army appeared Ferrand, Count of Flanders, with an immense host of hardy Flemings, together with the Count de Boulogne and several other of the minor confederates, while opposed to him was the young Duke of Champagne, the Duke of Burgundy, and the men of the commune of Soissons. To the right of the imperial army was a small body of English, with the Duke of Brabant and his forces in face of the Comte de Dreux, the Bishop of Beauvais, and a body of the troops of the clergy, while in the centre of each host, and conspicuous to both, were Otto, Emperor of Germany, and Philip Augustus of France, commanding in person the chosen knights of either monarchy. In the midst of the dark square of lances that surrounded the Emperor was to be seen a splendid car, from the centre of which rose a tall pole, bearing on the top the imperial standard, a golden eagle hovering above a dragon, while beside Philip Augustus was borne the royal banner of France, consisting of an azure field embroidered with fleur-de-lis of gold. On either hand of the king were ranged the knights selected to attend his person, whom we find named as William de Bar, Barthélemy de Roye, Peter de Malvoisin, Gérard Scroffa, Stephen of Longchamp, William of Mortemar, John of Rouvray, William de Gauland, and Henry Count de Bar, all men distinguished in arms and chosen for their high and chivalrous qualities. A dead silence pervaded the field. Each host, as we have said, gazed upon the other, still and motionless, waiting in awful expectation the first movement which should begin the horrid scene of carnage about to follow. It wanted but a word, a sign, the levelling of a lance, the sounding of a trumpet, to cast the whole dark mass of bloodthirsty insects there assembled into strife and mutual destruction. But yet there was a pause, as if each monarch felt the dreadful responsibility which that signal would bring upon his head, and hesitated to give it. Some reflections of the kind certainly passed through the mind of Philip Augustus, for turning to William de Mortemar, he said, "We must begin the fight. I seek not their blood, but God gives us a right to defend ourselves. They have leagued to crush me, and the carnage of this day be upon their head. Where is the oriflamme?" he continued, looking round for the consecrated banner of Saint Denis. "It has not yet repassed the river, sire," replied Gerard Scrofa. "I heard the tramp of the Commune still coming over the bridge, and filling up the ranks behind. The oriflamme was the first banner that passed, and therefore of course will be the last that returns." "We must not wait for it, then," said the king. "Henry de Bar, speed to Guerin, who is on the right, with the Count de St. Pol. Bid them begin the battle by throwing in a few men-at-arms to shake that heavy line of the Flemings. Then let the knights charge." The young count bowed low and set spurs to his horse, but his very passage along the line was a signal for the confederates to commence the fight. A flight of arrows and quarrels instantly darkened the sky, and fell thick as hail amongst the ranks of the French. The trumpets sounded, the lances were levelled, and two of the king's chaplains, who were placed at a little distance behind him, began to sing the 143rd Psalm, while the tears rolled plentifully from their eyes, from the effects of mingled fear, agitation, and devotion. In the meanwhile, 150 sergeants of arms charged the whole force of the Count of Flanders, according to the order of the king. His intention was completely fulfilled. Dropping the points of their lances, the French men-at-arms cast themselves into the midst of the Flemish knights, who, indignant at being attacked by men who had not received the honours of chivalry, fell upon them furiously, with little regard to their own good order. In an instant the horses of the French men-at-arms were all slain, but being men of the Commune of Soissons, trained to fight on foot as well as on horseback, they prolonged the fight hand to hand with the enemy's knights, and completely succeeded in throwing the centre of the imperial left wing into disarray. At that moment the battalion of knights under the Count de St. Pol charged in support of the men-at-arms, and with their long lances levelled in line swept all before them, cleaving through the host of Flemings, and scattering them abroad upon the plain, as a thunderbolt strikes a pine, and rends it into atoms. The strife thus begun upon the right wing of the royal army soon communicated itself to the centre, where, on a small mound, sat Philip Augustus, viewing with a calm observing eye the progress of the battle, though gradually the dust and steam of the fight, and the confused groups of the combatants, falling every moment into greater disorder, would have confounded a less keen and experienced glance than his. Though the left was now also engaged, the monarch's eye principally rested upon the right wing of his forces, where the Count of St. Pol, the Dukes of Burgundy and Champagne, were still struggling hard with the Flemings, whose second and third line, having come up, had turned the fortune of the day, and were driving back the French towards the river. "By the Lord of Heaven, Burgundy is down!" cried Philip. "Ho, Michael! Gallop to Sir Guy de Coucy, tell him to charge with the men of Tankerville to support the good Duke of Burgundy. Away!" The sergeant to whom he spoke galloped off like lightning to the spot where de Coucy was placed as a reserve. "By heaven, the Duke is down, and his banner too," continued the king, turning to Guerin, who now had joined him. "De Coucy moves not yet. Saint Denis to boot. They will turn our flank. Is the knight a coward or mad? Away, Guerin! Bid him charge for his honour." But the king saw not what de Coucy saw, that a fresh corps of the confederates was debouching from the road behind the imperial army. if he attacked the Flemings before this body had advanced, he not only left his own rear unguarded, but the flank of the whole army totally exposed. He paused, therefore, notwithstanding the critical situation of the Duke of Burgundy, till such time as this fresh body had, in the hurry and confusion of their arrival, advanced between him and the Flemings. Then, however, the 1,500 lances he commanded were levelled in an instant, the trumpets sounded, the chargers sprang forward, and, hurled like an avalanche against the flank of this newly arrived corps, the squadron of de Coucy drove them in pell-mell upon the Flemings, forced the Flemings themselves back upon the troops of the Emperor, and left a clear space for the soldiers of Burgundy and Champagne to rally round their chiefs. "Brave de Coucy!" cried the king, who had marked the manoeuvre. "Good knight! Stout lance! All goes down before him. Burgundy is up. His banner waves again. Ride, Walter the Young, and compliment the Duke for me. Who are those coming down? I cannot see for the dust." "They are the burgesses of Compiègne and Abbeville, and the Oriflammes, sir," replied Guillaume des Barres. "They want a taste of the fight, and are forcing themselves in between us and those Saxon serfs, who are advancing straight towards us." As he spoke, the men of the communes, eager to signalize themselves in the service of a king who had done so much for them, marched boldly into the very front of the battle, and mingled hand to hand with an immense body of German infantry that were approaching rapidly towards the king. The French communes, however, were inferior to the burly Saxons, both in number and in strength, and were, after an obstinate fight, driven back to the very foot of the mound on which Philip was placed. The knights and men-at-arms who surrounded him, seeing the battle so near the monarch's person, charged through the ranks of the burgesses, and mingling with the Saxon infantry, cut them down in all directions with their long, heavy swords. The German cavalry again spurred forward to support their own communes, and the fight became general around the immediate person of the monarch, who remained on the summit of the hillock, with no one but the Count de Montigny bearing his standard, and Sir Stephen of Longchamp, who had refrained from following the rest into the mêlée. "For God's sake, sire, retire a little," said the knight. "If you are hurt, all is lost." "Not a step for 1,000 empires," replied the king, drawing down his visor and unsheathing his sword, as he beheld 3 or 4 German knights spurring towards him at full career, followed by a large troop of footmen, contending with the burghers of Compiègne. "We must do our devoir as a knight as well as a king, Sir Stephen." "Mine, then, as a knight," cried Stephen of Longchamp, laying his lance in rest, and on he galloped at the foremost of the German knights, whom he hurled dead from his horse, pierced from side to side with the iron of the spear. The German that followed, however, without spending a blow on the French knight's casque, plunged his sword in his horse's chest, at a spot where the iron barding was wanting. Rider and horse went down at once, and the German, springing to the ground, drew a long knife from his side and knelt upon his prostrate adversary's chest. "Denis Mountjoy!" cried the king, galloping on to the aid of his faithful follower. "Denis Mountjoy, au secours!" But before he could arrive, the German knight had plunged his knife through the bars of the fallen man's helmet, and Stephen Longchamp was no more. The monarch avenged him, however, if he could not save, and as the Saxon's head was bent down, accomplishing his bloody purpose, he struck him so fierce a blow on the back of his neck, with the full sway of a vigorous and practised arm, that the hood of his mail shirt yielded at once to the blow, and the edge of the weapon drove on through the backbone. At that moment, however, the king found himself surrounded on every side by the German foot, who hemmed him in with their short pikes. The only knight who was near him was the Count de Montigny, bearing the royal banner, and nothing was to be seen around but the fierce faces of the Saxon pikemen, looking out from under their steel caps, drawing their circle closer and closer round him, and fixing their eager eyes upon the crown that he wore on the crest of his helmet; or else the forms of some German knights at a short distance, whirling about like armed phantoms through the clouds of dust that enveloped the whole scene. Sir Philip fought with desperate valour, plunging his horse into the ranks of the pikemen, and dealing sweeping blows around with his sword, which 4 or 5 times succeeded in clearing the space immediately before him. Well and nobly, too, did the Count de Montigny do his devoir, holding with one hand the royal banner, which he raised and depressed continually, to give notice to all eyes of the monarch's danger, and striking with the other on every side round Philip's person, which he thus protected for many minutes from the near approach of his enemies. It was in vain, however, that the king and his banner-bearer displayed such feats of chivalrous valour. Closer and closer the German burgesses hemmed them in. Many of the Saxon knights became attracted by the sight of the royal banner, and were urging their horses through the mêlée towards the spot where the conflict was raging so fiercely, when one of the serfs crept close to the king's charger. Philip felt his horse reeling underneath him, and in a moment the animal fell to the ground, bearing its rider down along with it. 100 of the long 3-edged knives, with which many of the Saxons fought that day, were instantly at the king's throat, and at the bars of his helmet. One thought of Agnes, one prayer to heaven, was all that seemed allowed to Philip Augustus. But at that moment the shout of "Auvergne! Auvergne!" rang upon his ear and yielded hope. With his head bent down to his saddle-bow, receiving 1,000 blows as he came, his horse all in foam and blood, his armour hacked, dented, and broken, Thibaut d'Auvergne clove the hostile press with the fierce rapidity of a falcon in its stoop. He checked his horse but by the royal banner. He sprang to the ground, dashed, weltering to the earth, the boors who were kneeling on the prostrate body of the king, and striding over it, whirled his immense mace round his head, at every blow sending the souls of some Saxon on the cold pilgrimage of death. The burgesses reeled back, but at the same time the knights who had been advancing hurled themselves upon the Count d'Auvergne, and heaped blow upon blow on his head. The safety of the whole host, the life and death or captivity of the king, the destiny of all Europe, perhaps of all the world, depended at that moment on the arm of a madman. But that arm bore it all nobly up, and though his armour was actually hewn from his flesh, and he himself bleeding from 100 wounds, he wavered not a step, but still striding over the body of the king, as he lay unable to rise, from the weight of his horse resting on his thigh, maintained his ground till, night after night, arriving on both sides, the combat became more equal. Still the fight around the royal banner was doubtful, when the battle cry of De Courcy was heard approaching. "Arcousy! Arcousy! St. Michael! St. Michael!" ran over the plain, and the long lances of Tankerville, which had twice completely traversed and retraversed the enemy's line, were seen sweeping on in unbroken masses, like a thundercloud advancing over the heaven. The regular order they had still preserved, as well as their admirable training, and confidence in their leader gave them vast superiority. The German pikemen were trampled under their tread, the knights were forced back at the point of the spear, the communes of Compiègne and Abbeville rallied behind them, and in a short time the field around the royal banner was once more clear of all enemies. The first thing was to free the king from the weight of his horse, which had been stabbed in the neck, and was now quite dead. The monarch rose, but before he remounted, though there were 1,000 horses held ready for him, and 1,000 voices pressing him to mount, he exclaimed, "Where is the Count d'Auvergne? I owe him my life. Stand back, Guillaume des Barres. Your foot is on his chest. That is he in the black armour." It was indeed the unhappy Count d'Auvergne, who had borne up under a multitude of wounds till the life of the king was in safety. He had then fallen in the mêlée, striking still, and lay upon a heap of dead that his hand had made. By the king's order, his casque was instantly unlaced, and Philip himself, kneeling beside him, raised his head upon his knee, and gazed in the ashy face to see if the flame of life's frail lamp was extinct indeed in the breast of him who had saved him from the tomb. D'Auvergne opened his eyes, and looked faintly in the face of the monarch. His lips moved, but no sound issued from them. "If thou diest, Auvergne," said Philip, in the fulness of his gratitude, "I have lost my best subject." The Count made another effort to speak. The king stooped over him and inclined his ear. "Tell her," said the broken accents of the dying man, "tell her that for her love I died to save your life." "I will," said Philip Augustus. "On my faith I will. And I know her not, or she will weep your fall." There was something like a faint smile played round the dying knight's lip. His eyes fixed upon the king, and the spirit that lighted them passed away for ever. "Farewell, Auvergne," said the king. "Des Barres, see his body moved and honoured. And now, good knights," said he, springing on horseback, "how fares the fight? My eyes have been absent too long, but by my faith you have worked well while I was down. The enemy's left is flying, or my sight deceives me." "'Tis true, my lord, 'tis true," replied Guillaume des Barres, "and Ferrand of Flanders himself is taken by the Duke of Burgundy." "Thank God for that!" cried Philip, and he turned his eyes quickly to the centre. "They seem in strange confusion there. Where is the imperial standard? Where is Otto himself?" "Otto has to do with Peter of Malvoisin and Gerard de Saux," replied William des Barres, laughing, "and finds them unpleasant neighbours doubtless. But do you know, sire, that a pike head is sticking in your cuirass?" "Mind not that," cried the king. "Let us charge. Otto's ranks are broken, his men dispersed. One gallant charge and the day is ours. Down with your lances, de Coucy. Men of Soissons, follow the king. Knights, remember your own renown. Burghers, fight for your firesides. Denis Mountjoy, upon them, charge!" It was the critical moment. Otto might have rallied, and his forces were still more than double those of the king, while the Count de Boulogne and the English, though the Earl of Salisbury had been dashed from his horse by the mace of the bellicose Bishop of Beauvais, were still maintaining the fight to the left. The well-timed and well-executed charge of the king, however, accompanied as he was by the choice chivalry of his realm, who had gathered about him to his rescue, decided the fate of the day. The Germans fled in confusion. Otto himself narrowly escaped being taken, and though a part of the right wing of the Confederates retreated in somewhat better array, yet the defeat even there was complete, and the Earl of Salisbury and the Count de Boulogne were both made prisoners. For nearly 6 hours the combat lasted, and when at last the flight was complete, the number of prisoners was so great that Philip dared not allow his troops to pursue the fugitives for any length of way, lest he should be mastered at last by those he had just conquered. At 5 o'clock the trumpets sounded to the standard to recall the pursuers, and thus ended the famous Battle of Bouvines, a strife and a victory scarcely paralleled in history. End of chapter 13. Section 43 of Philip Augustus by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The hurry and confusion of the battle was over. Order was greatly restored, and the victorious army had encamped on the banks of the river when Philip Augustus retired to his own tent, and, after having been disarmed by his attendants, commanded that they should leave him alone for an hour. No one was permitted to approach, and the monarch sat down to meditate over the vast and mighty deed he had accomplished. Oh, what a whirlpool of contending feelings must have been within his bosom at that moment! Policy, triumph, ambition, hate, revenge, and love, each claimed their place in his heart. The recollection of the difficulties he had overcome, the fresh memory of the agitating day in which he had overcome them, the glorious prospects yet to come, the past, the present, and the future raised their voices together, and with a sound like thunder called to him, "Rejoice!" But Philip Augustus sat with his hands clasped over his eyes in deep and even melancholy thought. A feeling of his mortality mingled, he knew not why or how, even with the exultation of his victory. To his mind's eye, a shadow, as if from the tomb, was cast over the banner of his triumph. A feeling of man's transitory littleness, a yearning after some more substantial glory, chastened the pride of the conqueror, and bending the knee before heaven's throne, he prayed fervently to the giver of all victory. After long deep thought he recalled his attendants, received several messengers that had come on from Lille, and ordering the hangings of his tent to be drawn up, he commanded the various chieftains who had distinguished themselves in that day's conflict to be called around him. It was a beautiful summer evening, and the rays of the declining sun shone over the field of battle into the tent of the victor, as he sat surrounded by all the pomp of royalty, receiving the greatest and noblest of his land. For each he had some gratulatory word, some mention of their deeds, some praise of their exertions, and there was a tempered moderation in his smile, a calm, grave dignity of aspect that relieved his greater barons from the fears which even they, who had aided to win it, could not help feeling, respecting the height to which such a victory might carry his ambition. There was not a touch of pride in his deportment, no, not even of that humility with which pride is sometimes fond to deck itself. It was evident that he knew he had won a great battle, and rejoiced, that he had vanquished his enemies, that he had conquered a confederated world. But yet he never felt himself more mortal, or less fancied himself kindred to a god. He had triumphed in anticipation. The arrogance of victory had exhausted itself in expectation, and he found it not so great a thing to have overcome a universe as he had expected. "Thanks, brave Burgundy, thanks," cried he, grasping the hand of the Duke as he approached him. "We have won a great triumph, and Burgundy has fully done his part. By my faith, Lord Bishop of Beauvais, thy mace is as good a weapon as thy crosier. I trust thou mayest often find texts in Scripture to justify thy so smiting the king's enemies." "I spill no blood, sire," replied the warlike bishop. "To knock on the head is not to spill blood, let it be remarked." "We have at all events, with thine aid, my Lord of Beauvais," said the king, smiling at the prelate's nice distinction, "we have at all events knocked on the head a great and foul confederation against our peace and liberties. Ha! my young Lord of Champagne, valiantly hast thou won thy knighthood. Guillaume des Barres, thou art a better knight than any of the Round Table, and to mend thy cellarage I give thee 500 acres in my valley of Soissons. And Pierre de Dreux, too, art thou, for once in thy life, satisfied with hard blows? De Courcy, my noble De Courcy, to whom I did some wrong before the battle, as thou hast said thyself, De Courcy, God send me ever such traitors as thou art. However, I have news for thee, will make thee amends for one hard word. Welcome, Saint Valery, as welcome as when you came to my succour this fair morning. Now, lords, we will see the prisoners, not to triumph over them, but that they may know their fate." According to the king's commands, the several prisoners of high rank who had been taken that morning were now brought before him, a part of the ceremony to which even his own barons looked with some doubt and anxiety, as well as the captives themselves, for amongst those who had fought on the other side were many who were not only traitors to the king, inasmuch as violating their oath of homage rendered them so, but traitors under circumstances of high aggravation, after repeated pardon and many a personal favour, yet who were also linked, by the nearest ties of kindred, to those in whose presence they now stood as prisoners. The first that appeared was the Earl of Salisbury, who, in the fear caused by the number of prisoners, had been bound with strong cords, and was still in that condition when brought before the king. "I am sorry to see you here, William of Salisbury," said Philip frankly, "but why those cords upon your hands? Who has dared so unworthily to bind a noble knight? Off with them, quick! Will you not yield yourself a true prisoner?" "With all my heart, Sir King," replied the earl, "since I may know better. The knaves tied me, I fancy, lest the prisoners should eat up their conquerors. But, by my faith, had the cowardly scum who have run from the field but fought like even your gownsmen, we should have won few prisoners, but some glory. For form's sake we must have some one to be hostage for your faith," said the king, "and then, good knight, you shall have as much liberty as a prisoner may. Who will be William of Salisbury's surety?" "That will I," said De Courcy, stepping forward, "in life and lands, though I have but little of the last." "Thank thee, old friend," said the Earl, grasping his hand. "We fought in different parts of the field, or we would have tried some of our old blows. But 'tis well as it is, for 'twas a bishop, they tell me, knocked me on the head. I saw him not, in faith, or I would have split his mitre for his pains." Prisoner after prisoner was now brought before the king, to most of whom he spoke in a tone to allay their fears. On Ferrand of Flanders, however, he bent his brows, strongly moved with indignation, when he remembered the presumptuous vaunting of that vain light prince, who had boasted that within a month he would ride triumphant into Paris. "Now, rebellious vassal," said the monarch, with severe dignity of aspect, "what fate does thy treason deserve? Snake, thou hast stung us for fostering thee in our bosom, and the pleasures of Paris, shown to thee in the hospitality of our court, have made thee covet the heritage of thy lord. As thou hast boasted, so shall it befall thee, and thou shalt ride in triumph into our capital, but, by heaven's queen, it shall not be to sport with jugglers and courtesans." Ferrand turned deadly pale, in his already excited fears misconstruing the king's words. "I hope, my lord," said he, "that you will think well before you strike at my life. Remember, I am but your vassal for these lands of Flanders, in right of my wife, that I am the son of an independent monarch, and my life may not—" "Thy life!" cried Philip, his lip curling with scorn. "Fear not for thy pitiful life. Get thee gone. I butcher not my prisoners. But, by the Lord, I will take good care that ye rebel not again. Now, Renaud of Boulogne," he continued, turning to the gigantic Count of Boulogne, who, of all the confederates, had fought the longest and most desperately, entertaining no hope of life if taken, both from being one of the chief instigators of the confederacy, and from many an old score of rebellion not yet wiped off between himself and the king. He appeared before the monarch, however, with a frank smile upon his jovial countenance, as if prepared to endure with good humour the worst that could befall; and seeing that, as a kind of trophy, one of the pages bore in his enormous casque, on the crest of which he had worn two of the broad blades of whalebone, near 6 feet high, he turned laughing to those around, while the king spoke to Ferrand of Flanders. "Good faith," said he, "I thought myself a leviathan, but they have managed to catch me notwithstanding." "Now, Renaud of Boulogne," said the king sternly, "how often have I pardoned thee, canst thou?" "Faith, my lord," replied the count, "I never was good at reckoning; but this I do know, that you have granted me life oftener than I either deserved or expected, though I cannot calculate justly how often." "When you do calculate, then," said Philip, "add another time to the list; but remember, by the bones of all the saints, it is the last." "Faith, my lord, you shall not break their bones for me," replied the count, "for I have made a resolution to be your good vassal for the future; and as my good friend Count Julian of the Mount says, my resolutions are as immovable as the centre." "Ha, Count Julian!" said the king. "You are welcome, fair count, and by heaven we have a mind to deal hardly with you. You have been a comer and goer, sir, in all these errands. You have been one of the chief stirrers up of my vassals against me; and by the Lord, if block and axe were ever well won, you have worked for them. However, here stands Sir Guy de Coucy, true knight, and the king's friend. Give him the hand of your daughter, his lady love, and you save your head upon your shoulders." "My lord, it cannot be," replied old Sir Julian stoutly. "I have already given the knight his answer. What I have said is said. My resolutions are as immovable as the centre, and I'd sooner encounter the axe than break them." "Then, by heaven, the axe shall be your doom," cried Philip, giving way to one of his quick bursts of passion at the bold and obstinate tone in which his rebellious vassal dared to address him. "Away with him to the block! And know, old mover of rebellions, that your lands and lordships and your daughter's hand, I, as your sovereign lord, will give to this brave knight, after you have suffered the punishment of your treason and your obstinacy." Sir Julian's cheek turned somewhat pale, and his eye twinkled, but he merely bit his lip, and, firm in his impenetrable obstinacy, offered no word to turn aside the monarch's wrath. De Coucy, however, stepped forward and prayed the king, as Sir Julian had been taken by his own men, to give him over to him, when he doubted not he would be able to bring him to reason. "Take him then, de Courcy," said Philip. "I give you power to make what terms with him you like, but before he quits this presence he consents to his daughter's marriage with you, or he quits it for the block. Let us hear how you will convert him." "What I have said is said," muttered Sir Julian. "My resolutions are as immovable as the centre." "Sir Julian," said de Courcy, standing forward before the circle, while the prisoner made up his face to look as sturdy obstinacy that would have done honour to an old well-seasoned mule, "you told me once that I might claim your daughter's hand if ever Guillaume de la Roche-Guyon, to whom you had promised her, being dead, you should be fairly my prisoner, and I could measure acre for acre with your land. Now I have to tell you that William de la Roche fell on yonder plain, pierced from the back to the front by one of the lances of Tankerville, as he was flying from the field. You are, by the king's bounty and my good fortune, my true and lawful prisoner, and surely the power of saving your life and giving you freedom may be reckoned against wealth and land." "No, no," said Sir Julian. "What I have said—" But he was interrupted by the king, who had recovered from the first heat into which Sir Julian's obstinacy had cast him, and was now rather amused than otherwise with the scene before him. "Hold, Count Julian," cried he. "Do not make any objection yet. The only difficulty is about the lands, it seems. That we will soon remove." "Oh, that alters the case," cried Count Julian, not sorry in his heart to be relieved from the painful necessity of maintaining his resolution at the risk of his life. "If you, sire, in your bounty, choose to make him my equal in wealth, William de la Roche-Guyon being dead, and I being his prisoner, all the conditions will be fulfilled, and he shall have my daughter. What I have said is as firm as fate." "Well, then," replied the king, glancing his eyes towards the barons who stood round, smiling at the old knight's mania, "we will not only make de Courcy your equal in wealth, Sir Julian, but far your superior. A court of peers, lords, a court of peers. Let my peers stand around." Such of the spectators as were by right peers of France advanced a step from the other persons of the circle, and the king proceeded. "Count Julian of the Mount," said he, in a stern voice, "we, Philip II., King of France, with the aid and counsel of our peers, do pronounce you guilty of lèse-majesté, and do declare all your fiefs, lands, and lordships, wealth, furniture, and jewels, forfeited and confiscated to the crown of France, to use and dispose thereof, as shall be deemed expedient." "A judgment, a judgment!" cried the peers, while the countenance of poor Count Julian fell 1,000 degrees. "Now, sir," continued the king, "without a foot of land in Europe, and without a besant to bless yourself, William de la Roche-Guyon being dead, and you that good knight's prisoner, we call upon you to fulfil your word to him, and consent to his marriage with your daughter Isidore, on pain of being held false and mansworn, as well as stubborn and mulish." "What I have said is said," replied Count Julian, putting forth his wonted proposition in a very crestfallen tone. "My resolutions are always as firm as the centre. De Courcy, I promised her to you under such circumstances. They are fulfilled, and she is yours, though it is hard that I must marry my daughters to a beggar." "Beggar, sir!" cried the king, his brow darkening again. "Let me tell you, that though rich enough in worth and valour alone to match the daughter of a prince, Sir Guy de Courcy, as he stands there, possesses double in lands and lordships what you have ever possessed. De Courcy, it is true, the lands and lordships of Tankerville, and all those fair domains upon the banks of the broad Rhone, possessed by the Count of Tankerville, who wedded your father's sister, are now yours, by a charter in our royal treasury, made under his hand some 10 years ago, and warranted by our consent. We have ourselves, pressed by the necessities of the state, taken for the last year the revenue of those lands, purposing to make restitution to you, if it should appear that the count was really dead, to him if he returned from Palestine, whither he was said to have gone. But we find ourselves justified by an unexpected event. We acted in this by the counsel of the wise and excellent hermit of Vincennes, now a saint in God's paradise, and we have just learned that the Count de Tancarville himself it was who died 10 years ago in the person of that same Bernard, the anchorite of Vincennes. He had lived there in that holy disguise for many years, and it was so long since we had seen him, the change in his person by fasts and macerations was so great, and his appearance as a hermit altogether so different from what it was as the splendid Count of Tancarville, that though not liable to forget the faces we have seen, in his case were totally deceived. On his deathbed he wrote to us this letter, full of pious instruction and good counsel. At the same time he makes us the unnecessary prayer of loving and protecting you. You, therefore, wed the proud old man's daughter, far his superior in every gift of fortune, and as some punishment to his vanity and stubbornness, we endow you and your heirs with all those fiefs that he has justly forfeited, leaving you to make what provision for his age you yourself may think fit. Count Julian hung his head, but here let it be said that he had never any cause to regret that the king had cast his fortunes into such a hand, for De Courcy was one of those whose hearts, nobly formed, expand rather than contract under the sunshine of fortune. End of chapter 14. Section 44 of Philip Augustus by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. 6 days had elapsed after the scenes we have described in our last 2 chapters, and Philip Augustus had taken all measures to secure the fruits of his victory, when, at the head of a gay party of knights and attendants, no longer burdened with warlike armour, but garmented in the light and easy robes of peace, the conquering monarch spurred along the banks of the Oise, anxious to make Agnes a sharer of his joy, and to tell her that, though the crafty policy of Rome still prolonged the question of his divorce, he was now armed with power to dictate what terms he pleased, and to bring her enemies to her feet. 6 months had now more than expired, during which he had consented not to see her, and that absence had given to his love all that magic light with which memory invests past happiness. The brightest delight, too, of hope was added to his feelings, the hope of seeing joy re-blossom on the cheek of her he loved, and the inspiration of the noblest purpose that can wing human endeavour carried him on, the purpose of raising and comforting and bestowing happiness. It may easily be believed, then, that the monarch was in one of his gayest and most gladsome moods, and to De Courcy, who rode by his side, full of as high hopes and glad anticipations as himself, he ever and anon poured forth some of the bright feelings that were swelling in his bosom. The young knight, too, hurrying on towards the castle of Rolleboise, where Isidore, now his own, won by knightly deeds and honourable effort, still remained, uncertain of her fate, gave way at once more to the natural liveliness of his disposition, and living in an age when ceremony had not drawn her rigid barrier between the monarch and his vassal, suffered the high spirits, which for many months had been, as it were, chained down by circumstance, to shine out in many a quick sally and cheerful reply. The death of his companion in arms, the unhappy Count d'Auvergne, would indeed throw an occasional shade over De Courcy's mind, but the regrets which we in the present age experience for the loss of a friend in such a manner, and which De Courcy was formed to feel as keenly as anyone, in that age met with many alleviations. He had died knightly in his harness, defending his monarch. He had fallen upon a whole pile of enemies his hand had slain. He had wrought high deeds and won immortal renown. In the eyes of De Courcy such a death was to be envied, and thus, though, when he thought of never beholding his friend again, he felt a touch of natural grief for his own sake, yet, as he remembered the manner of his fate, he felt proud that his friend had so finished his career. It was a bright July morning, and would have been extremely hot, had not an occasional cloud skimmed over the sky, and cast a cool though fleeting shadow upon the earth. One of these had just passed, and had let fall a few large drops of rain upon them in its course. the glossy stains of which on his black charger's neck Philip was examining with the sweet idleness of happiness, when de Courcy called his attention to a pigeon flying overhead. "A carrier pigeon as I live, my lord," said the knight. "I have seen them often in Palestine. Look, there is its roll of paper." "Has anyone a falcon?" cried the king, apparently more agitated than de Courcy expected to see on so simple an event. "I would give 1,000 besants for a falcon." One of the knight's pages in the train carried, as was common in those days even during long journeys, a falcon on his wrist, and hearing the monarch's exclamation, he in a moment unhooded his bird and slipped its guesses. Lifting its keen eyes towards the skies, the hawk spread its wings at once and towered after the pigeon. "Well flown, good youth," cried the king. "What is thy name?" "My name is Hubert," replied the boy, somewhat abashed. "My name is Hubert, Beausire." "Hubert? What, nothing else? Henceforth, then, be Hubert the Falconpré." And having sportively given this name to the youth, a name which descended distinguished to after years, he turned his eyes towards the falcon and watched its progress through the sky. "The bird will miss his stroke, I fear me," said the king, turning towards de Courcy; and then, seeing some surprise at his anxiety painted on the young knight's countenance, he added, "That pigeon is from Rolleboise. I brought the breed from Ascalon. Agnes would not have loosed it without some weighty cause." As he spoke, the falcon towered above the pigeon, struck it, and at a whistle brought it, trembling and half dead with fear, to the page, who instantly delivered it from the clutches of its winged enemy, and gave it into the hands of the king. Philip took the scrap of paper from the poor bird's neck, caressed it for a moment, and then again threw it up in the air. At first it seemed as if it would have fallen, from the fear which it had undergone, though the well-trained falcon had not injured it in the least. After a few faint whirls, however, it gained strength again, rose in a perpendicular line into the sky, took 2 or 3 circles in the air, and then darted off at once towards Paris. In the meanwhile, Philip Augustus gazed upon the paper he had thus received, and whatever were the contents, they took the colour from his cheek. Without a word, he struck his horse violently with his spurs, urged him into a gallop, and, followed by his train as best they might, drew not in his rein till he stood before the barbican of the castle of Rolleboise. Pale cheeks and anxious eyes encountered his glance, as he dashed over the drawbridge the moment it was lowered. "The Queen!" cried he. "The Queen! How fares the Queen?" But without waiting for a reply, he sprang to the ground in the court, rushed past the crowd of attendants, through the hall, up the staircase, and paused not till he reached the door of that chamber which he and Agnes had inhabited during the first months of their union, and in which, from its happy memories, he knew she would be fond to dwell. There, however, he stopped, the beating of his heart seeming almost to menace him with destruction if he took a step farther. There was a murmur of voices within, and after an instant's pause, he opened the door, and gliding past the tapestry, stood at the end of the room. The chamber was dim, for the night was near, but at the farther extremity was the faint light of a taper contending with the pale remains of the day. He could see, however, that his marriage bed was arrayed like the couch of the dying, and there were priests standing round in silence, and women in tears, while one lovely girl, whose face he knew not, knelt by the bedside, and supported on her arm the pale and ashy countenance of another, over which the grey shadow of death seemed advancing fast. Philip started forward. Could that be Agnes, that pale, blighted thing, over whose dim and glassy eyes a strange, unlifelike film was drawn, the precursor of the shroud? Could that be Agnes, the bright, the beautiful, the beloved? A faint exclamation which broke from the attendants as they beheld him reached even the heavy ear of the dying. The film was drawn back from her eyes for a moment. Life blazed up once more, and concentrated all its parting light in the full, glad, ecstatic gaze which she fixed upon the countenance of him she loved. A smile of welcome and farewell hung upon her lip, and with a last effort she stretched forth her arms towards him. With bitter tears, Philip clasped her to his bosom. Agnes bent down her head upon her neck and died. O glory, O victory, O power, ye shining emptiness, ye bubbles on the stream of time. End of chapter 15. End of Philip Augustus, or the Brothers in Arms, by George Payne Rainsford James. Read by Lynne Thompson in Tucson, Arizona.